Good evening, everyone. Here is the malfunctioning hologram of Dr. Jones, better known as Diana Clarion. And this is the place for intellectual, spiritual honesty. And with me is Carrie Todd. Hi, Carrie.
Sorry, I was muted. Hello.
How you doing tonight?
I'm doing well.
We're looking at a process rather than a conclusion, a method rather than a brute fact. And this is the sort of thing we want to do. We don't want to be in love, as Dr. Jones says, with our isms, be it theism, be it atheism, agnosticism, dog named Booism, as far as that goes. What's your feeling on that, Gary?
I agree with that. We should also have some fidelity toward what our beliefs are. As far as if you do believe something is the case, then there's no reason to not state that forthrightly. So at the same time, that's why I love this channel, is because I know that that people can come here and state what their position is, what their belief is, what their worldview is, without fear of being ridiculed, and in an environment of respectful dialogue.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know that in my own daily life, if you want to put it that way, there are times that I have to have a position for practical reasons. That does not mean that that position is not open to revision. As a matter of fact, it should be. It must be. Things may change for whatever reason. And that is part of being committed to that process.
Sure. And at the same time, if you have to take everyone at face value, honor their experiences, so that if someone else is telling you that they've had a particular experience that leads them to believe a certain thing is true, then accept that at face value. You can question it, of course, but clearly such a person has a reason for coming to that conclusion. Their reason could be silly, it could be fallacious, but nonetheless, they do have some reason for coming to that position. It's important to also, if you hear something that seems convincing, but you choose to stick with a position, that's just as closed-minded. What am I saying here? I'm saying, like the idea of open-mindedness. If you change your position on a dime, that's not smart either. You shouldn't just change your position every time you hear something. You got to carefully weigh things against your existing schema, and see if it fits. If it doesn't fit, you can accommodate it by moving some things around, or you can jettison it and start over. I don't think it's fair, though, it's not fair for me to say that any particular theist is wrong because there is no evidence for their position. Because I don't think that's true. I think there is evidence for their position. Otherwise, they wouldn't hold that position. It may not be evidence that I accept, but nonetheless, it's evidence.
Okay, definitely. What I'm hearing here is have an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out. And
pretty much
be open to whatever someone else may have as a justification for their beliefs, for their positions. As you say, it may be totally silly, but the thing is, why are you holding that belief? Examine that. And there's the process. It's, I believe this particular thing, but I'm not going to leave it right there. I need to know why I do and how it fits into the rest of the world.
Right. And there's another issue that comes up from time to time with the words that we use, of course. And I know that Stephen has a much more how would you say, complex way of using the word justification than I'm using it. And
I would say that.
I'm quite willing to hear that later on. But when I use the word justification, all I mean by it is a reason to come to that conclusion. So I think that whatever my position is, as long as I have some reason that I came to it, that's my justification for believing it to be the case. That's how I'm using the word. I know that it's probably a laden piece of vocabulary that could mean a lot of things.
Now, I know that, let's see, if I remember correctly, you're a mathematician.
No, I'm not. I don't. I'm not actually. I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't want to be
Okay.
misidentified too. I teach math, but I'm not a mathematician. My degree is in
Okay.
science, but I have enough math background to teach math at the middle school and high school level. But I'm an educator.
Okay, because I was thinking of how, on my incorrect assumption earlier, that our methods may differ. Because mathematics and then the hard sciences have a slightly different method of searching for justification, searching for proof. And then that again is different from that of the philosopher, although philosophy is involved in both areas. Yeah, I come from biology.
Sure.
And experimentation, observation is what is the justification in my field. Now, you said you have a degree in science, so I guess you're coming from more or less the same area then, no? Yes?
Right. My undergraduate is in geology.
Ah,
So I'm familiar with how I'm familiar with how philosophy and science go hand in hand, except that from my understanding and my experience, from the science side of it, the philosophy of science is more inductive. Of course, you can use deductive reasoning, you can deduce things in science, but in general, it's an inductive vocation because you're observing the world around you and reaching some conclusion based on that observation. Whereas in mathematics, it is more deductive because mathematics, I suppose people argue about this, but as far as I understand, mathematics is a philosophy, it's not a science. So they will, in mathematics, we have definitions, we have postulates, which are things that are self-evidently true. And we can use those things to prove things. And whatever our conclusion is, that proof is now deduced based on the definitions or axioms or postulates that you had that are the fundamental things. But mathematics is different in the sense that it's deductive.
yeah, and that feeds into what we were talking about last week in theories of truth, because I am totally unfamiliar with theories of truth from the way that philosophy goes. I never really had very much of a philosophy curriculum when I was at uni. I mean, both times it was missing, and I learned a great deal last week. And I know there's a lot more to go, and I'm thinking that hopefully we'll be hearing from Stephen and Dr. Jones, a bit more about that and learning what it takes, basically.
Sure. Is it just you and me right now, though, conversing? I don't want to dominate the time.
No, it's for the next few minutes. It's you and me.
Okay. So
You and me against the world. I think Helen Reddy put it.
you got it. Yeah, I'm not educated in any sense in philosophy. However, I only read it as a layperson. But as I understand, what truth is something that's really thorny, and it has been for millennia. I mean, but Pontius Pilate is quoted as saying, "What is truth?" in the Gospel of John, 2,000 years ago. I know people argue about that date precisely, but at any rate, I know that there's a correspondence theory, and I know that there's a coherence theory, and I don't I don't spend a lot of time reading about those things. I think it's dull to me because it doesn't impact whether or not something is true. It doesn't impact, that I'm aware of anyway, whether truth exists. I think most people agree that there is something called truth. There are statements that are true or propositions that are true. So breaking that down into the nuance of coherence versus correspondence or the other theories that are available, I think there's also a linguistic theory of truth, or I know I've read about others, but I don't remember what they are. I just think that's probably that's a little too nuanced for what most people are ready for.
I saw Stephen smiling in the green room back there when you mentioned that, to you, the theories were more or less dull, but I'm with you on that one. I never really paid that much attention to the theories of truth, and now I'm thrown in kind of feet first and discovering that there is a great deal to be learned, and perhaps it will be useful.
No, I agree. I don't want to be interpreted as how do you say, downplaying the importance of that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that it's something that I don't find particularly enthralling. So I haven't devoted much study to it beyond reading basic lay texts. So, I'm open to those things. But if the crux of what we're discussing and possibly disagreeing on comes down to what theory of truth you're using, then that's not the kind of discussion that interests me, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I kind of know the feeling. All I grew up with was, I guess, basically a correspondence theory.
Right.
Look at what you're observing, relate how what you think about it relates to reality as it is observed. And I know there are different ways of looking at that too. I mean, when you go to Niels Bohr, when you go to that whole Copenhagen school, and then you end up with Alvin Schrödinger, who's saying that you have the cat experiment where you have a necessary what's the word I'm looking for, a self-contradiction, if you will. The cat has to be alive and dead at the same time. So, how does one fit that in? I'm looking forward to Stephen and Dr. Jones coming up in a few minutes to really get into that. And maybe I'll learn something else today, and then the day won't be wasted.
I know that I've heard Stephen, and rather than heard, I think I've read his writing before, where he speaks to the idea of truth and corresponding to reality, how those things relate to the observer, the person observing the reality, and that there is some implication there for what is true. So I remember when I read that my eyes glazed over, and because that gets back to that thing where, I don't know, it just goes to a point where, well, yeah, imagine being in a room where people are all speaking languages that you can't understand. That's kind of how I feel. And it's not that I'm uneducated. I have some degree of education. It's just no matter how many times I've read that or heard it, it never rings a bell with me. And I can't explain why, and I'm willing to try again. But yeah, that just gets to that it just makes me wonder if that really impacts or has any impact on any proposition that I'm trying to discuss or sort through.
Yeah, and as I said, that's part of what I'm learning here too. It's where does that all fit in? Because so far to me, sorry, Stephen, but you know, a lot of it does sound like playing with words, and I need to know why it isn't. And so far, I'm starting to learn why, and I hope to continue.
I don't know that I would use the phrase playing with words, because I'm pretty certain that he knows what he's trying to say. I'm not receiving it for some reason. However, I would imagine that he probably has more formal education in philosophy than I do. So that being the case, if you start talking about earth science with me, I'm probably going to use some words that you're not going to. Well, maybe you will. I don't know, but that a lot of people won't recognize.
Yeah.
And I'll use some words that you would use in colloquial everyday English that mean something different within the discipline of geology. So when I talk about correlation in geology, I mean something totally different than what a statistician means when she says correlation.
Mm-hmm. And I guess that's part of it, is learning the how is it, the declarative isn't the word, but I think it's about as close as I can get. The definitive meanings of words within disciplines.
Like esoteric vocabulary.
Yeah, and okay, and you know, that's the sort of thing I'm after, and I guess it's about time to start coming after it, because I see that both of Mickey's hands are on the 12. So why don't we bring Dr. Jones in to kind of introduce the topic and take it from there? Dr. Jones.
I tell you what, I'm really impressed with what you guys are talking about. I mean, this is a very good conversation. I almost sent Stephen Hoyt a text saying, let's kick back for another 45 minutes. I mean, Carrie, you're putting some things on the table that are, in my opinion, amazing. Thank you so much. You did a good job. And you did as well, Diana. Tonight's show is about these isms. And I'm not talking about compassionism. I'm not talking about alcoholism. I'm talking about something within the framework of the great debate, atheism, theism, and agnosticism. And I added a dog named Boo when I was talking to the producers, simply because I would hate to think that we would only focus on 1, 2, or 3 things without leaving the door open to something else. And I really like some of Ozzy's work. He's not a very good philosopher, or in epistemology, he's not doing very well, and so typically he's not very measured in that. You know what I'm talking about, Stephen? I mean, he's clumsy with words. He's not articulate. I mean, what's wrong with Ozzy? I mean, is he staying in the igloos or what?
Wow, you got...
I told you that I was going to do that. I mean, Ozzy, he's brilliant in philosophy, but perhaps he could teach us a thing or two about an igloo or two. But no, he's putting things on the table every day, and I'll never forget when he said lack theist, and I'll never forget when he offered someone, I can't remember the someone, but he said, plants lack faith, they lack belief, but they're not an atheist, because some people were just trying to build the tent of atheism as large as they can, I guess. And Ozzy was pushing back, and so, Ozzy's a very balanced individual. And so he's one of these guys that we need in the conversation. But I like to kid with him a bit. He's a good guy. But let's cut to the chase and get into this. And because, and please understand, I'm going to have to kick back a little bit. My blood pressure's been way, way high, and so I may sound like a crazy man. So bear with me. But before we get started, would you like to say anything to anyone? Because after we get finished talking, I'm trying to get as many people in the hangout that you guys are in, so that you can have a conversation that would maybe deal with some of the questions that typically come up, because most of the people who do join Hangouts, they have a lot to say on Facebook and other places. And so what say you before we start the show?
I'll preface, there was a book I read maybe 15 years ago called Crimes Against Logic. And the author, I think maybe in the first or at least the second chapter, had to admit that if you're still reading the book by then there's something wrong with you. People don't like logic, and he hated writing the book. So when we're talking about theories of truth and things glazing over, eyes glazing over, well, that's me too. It's just there are some things in there that are important to me, given some other things that I'm interested in. But what definitely helps is having a conversation that we can have where we can apply those different theories to see why it matters. So when we're talking about descriptions, we may be able to use this ism conversation to come up with a distinction or an importance about when we say something is true. Is there something about the description itself that's magical, that it has a property of truth? Or are we really saying, I'm entitled to say this because I have really good reasons to give this description? And that really, it makes a difference when you start to answer questions that people are asking about. Is there more right or grounds to atheism than theism or agnosticism? Who's right and how do we tell? And so it's kind of, I was trying to approach that last week as a community effort. We have to agree on some kind of common ground before we can even have a discussion. And a lot of times philosophy is trying to get us to a common ground, or at least enable us to identify where the problems are going to come up between different people in how they view things. So if everybody's agreed on some kind of methodology, if we all agree on correspondence theory, we'll never talk about truth again. We'll just know how that word is used. But if it's somebody's deflationary, which I think Carrie was talking or hinting at with saying there are linguistic notions of truth, deflationary may be one where I'm just saying something is true, meaning I have good reasons to assert something, not that there's some magic property. But anyway, having a background or some kind of example to apply all these different far-reaching concepts that are otherwise boring, it really makes a difference. It becomes interesting. So maybe we can kill a couple of birds with one stone tonight.
Okay, I'm going to be reading, just to save time, that is from some of the stuff that's been published from these redactionists from Stanford, and I know it's pitiful writing. These guys don't know what in the hell they're talking about. They're just fly-by-nights. They really need to attend, some revivals that Saitin Bruggencate is having, or Eric Coven. He gives a lot of lectures on creationism these days. In fact, for those of you who don't believe in the Ark, they've actually built one. You can go there. But from the Stanford guys, this is what they are publishing, putting out. You have a lot of people working behind the scenes. I've done some ghost writing for many people, and when you're a ghost writer, it's typically, the popular guy that gets recognition, and those of us who just write for them, who are, in a sense, the thinkers behind it, we never get recognized. However, with that said, let's talk about atheism for a few minutes. Atheism, according to this read, R-E-A-D, atheism is typically defined in terms of theism. And I think that's worth thinking about. Where is this guy going with this information? He's simply saying there are various usages of atheism, just like with many other words. But he's putting this on the table, I think, in a way that gives us an understanding how to approach the conversation. He simply says, atheism is typically defined in terms of theism. Theism, in turn, is best understood as a proposition, something that is either true or false. It is often defined as the belief that God exists. Now, I would push back on that quite a bit, but I'm not going to tonight. My blood pressure is way high, almost 160 over 120, so that's not good. So he says it's often defined, well, it is often defined as the belief that God exists, but that's not where most theologians are. However, that's not the point. But here, belief means something believed, okay? And so he's making a distinction here that I want you to explain. It refers to the propositional content of belief, not to the attitude or psychological state of believing. And so before I go further, I want you to exegete that for us all. And I'm going to sit back and wear my orange shirt.
Yeah, well, here we go with is it going to make people's eyes glaze over? I can, and a real life example is just myself. I think that there's a state of affairs and God's a part of it. I think there's something like a God. That's just the way I'm built. It's part of it's affirmed in my experiences, even though I realize that I could be wrong about my experiences or how I'm interpreting them. So that's how I'm built. That's a disposition that I have. But when I'm looking at thinking about what all that means and what that would imply, there's a proposition that God exists. And I think that's a false proposition. I don't think it makes sense. So it means that I have a strong problem with the words and what they're trying to add up to in the meaning. So I disagree that there's sense to say God exists, because I don't know exactly what I mean when I say the word God. But let's just assume that I can come up with some kind of logical description where it would make sense to use the word God. And I still may at that point, which I actually do, have a problem with the actual proposition of saying.
Okay, you're going to have to repeat that because for some reason Google went crazy and we lost your audio. Repeat about the last 3 to 4 sentences. Hello.
It's saying existence. So if by existence we mean something that's temporal, and what we mean by God is something that's not bound by space or time, in a general sense. So God as a proposition just doesn't exist. However, there's that conflict because what I'm saying is there is some reality that God exists in, but I don't even know how to talk about it. So I have one attitude towards a state of affairs that God exists, but when we come to the propositional level about what it is that I'm saying and meaning and trying to convey, I would say anything that I say about God is false as a proposition. I would just reject it because either it doesn't make sense or it doesn't apply to the object that we're trying to describe. Does that make sense?
It does, but I was talking with Jerry Boschman. He's the author of Hope Beyond Hell. He's very much a universalist. He does dental ministry all over the world, and what that means is he goes into these third world countries, free of charge, by the way. He pulls teeth. He takes care of people who are suffering, out in the bush or whatever you want to call it. But I was talking with him yesterday, and he said, wow, you're just way too complicated. When I listen to your shows, everybody's using such, language that none of us are getting it. And he's a very well-educated individual. He just came out with his more recent book, and I was trying to help him. That is because he's getting ready to do a tour both on television and radio, trying not to, and please understand who I am. I love people unconditionally. I accept people unconditionally, and I become their ally. In other words, I support atheists even though I'm not an atheist. And I told him, I will support you as a universalist, but I'm so not a universalist. I don't even think that what you're saying is a reasonable approach toward the text. I think that, much of what you're doing is very unmeasured. It's in a sense crazy, but if you want to do it, I'll still be your ally. I'm going to support you, but I disagree with the premise of your work. And he applauded that, but during the conversation he said, for those of us who are lay people in Greek and Hebrew and lay people in, let's say, philosophical discussions, we need something a bit more simple. And so let me ask this question again. If I'm talking about, when this writing that I'm reading, it says here belief means something belief. It refers to the propositional content of belief, not to the attitude or psychological state of believing. This is why it makes sense to say that theism is true or false, or to argue for or against theism. My point is, could you explain that for, let's say, Billy Bob, or someone who works on a shrimp boat who really doesn't have enough time to really get into the nomenclature that we're using tonight? Because I want them to understand.
Yeah, as far as the propositional content, it would just be that God exists. That's the propositional content, and we're saying that there's a state of affairs that applies to. There either is or is not a God. So you can either believe that statement is true, or if you deny that it's true, you accept that it is false. There's no other way around it. Well, there are a couple ways, but anyway, in general, it's either true or false, and denying the truth of it will mean that you accept that it's not the state of affairs. So that's just black and white. That's how propositions work, at least since Frege. But you may have all kinds of different feelings or dispositions, which we would call beliefs, about that one state of affairs. So in trying to separate those out so that you can talk about the attitudes versus just the proposition itself, it's helpful to talk in those categorical terms. Is that simple enough?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
In other words, I want those people on the shrimp boat, if they're listening via whatever. I've got this amazing cell phone. I get coverage where most people don't, and some people have satellite phones, and so it's interesting just to see where people are listening and why they are listening. Let me read this a little bit further. It says, if, however, atheism is defined in terms of theism, and theism is the proposition that God exists, and not the psychological condition of believing that there is a God. Let me read that again. And not the psychological condition of believing that there is a God. Then it follows that atheism is not the absence of psychological condition of believing that God exists. In other words, he goes further. He says, now when it comes to the alpha or the A in atheism, it must be understood as a negation instead of an absence. He furthers his point as not instead of without. Therefore, in philosophy at least, atheism should be construed as the proposition that God does not exist, or, more broadly, the proposition that there are no gods. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I spent the last day on last week's episode, of course, on YouTube you can and whatever. And there was one person that was kind of trolling that basically wanted to say that atheism is simply a lack of belief, which I went at length. I mean, you can hopefully people will go and read that, because I went into in depth on the different things that we're talking about now, and I'll try and bring out the highlights here so that people don't have to go back and research. But anyway, in two places, and that was the most thorough. But yeah, if you have, regardless of whether or not you have certain feelings about whether or not there's God, can be irrespective of the proposition that there is a God, and you deny it. And again, this is a great example, simply because there's no justification to hold that belief. There's no reason someone is giving you. Someone comes up to me and says, there's a Bigfoot. Well, I don't really think about Bigfoot. I don't really care. But if there's no reason stated for me to think that there's a Bigfoot, I have no disposition that there aren't any big feet or Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them, but I will reject and deny the proposition that there are Bigfoot, because I haven't been given any, it hasn't been shown to have any warrant. Why would I change my mind about the existence of Bigfoot if nobody's given me any reason to? So I don't have any dispositions about the existence of Bigfoot, but I certainly have an opinion about the proposition. It's false until there's justification to say that it's true.
Right. You know, one of the things that I need to put on the table tonight, and I have to be honest about this, so many times when I'm talking with atheists within their groups, or even atheists, or even theists, one thing that I get is you don't understand atheism, or you don't understand theism, or you don't understand agnosticism. The reason that I chose Stanford was because I think there a lot of philosophers, you know, agree to a large extent with what's being stated here. And so I wanted to read something that, you know, everyone could Google and read over and over and over and over again. And so with that said, let me continue. This definition has added virtue, of making atheism a direct answer to one of the most important metaphysical questions in philosophy of religion, namely, is there a God? There are two possible direct answers to this question, yes, which is theism, and no, which is atheism. Answers like I don't know, no one knows, I don't care, and an affirmative answer has never been established, or the question is meaningless, are not direct answers to the question. And I get that. And so before we go any further, could you, do some exposition there?
Yeah, I had given that Stanford paper to the person a couple days ago to read through, because I thought a lot of points were brilliantly made in simple terms, and that was one of the most poignant things in it. That there is a atheism, just in attitude alone, the way people perceive what it means to be an atheist, just in general around the world every day, is that it is a direct answer to the proposition there is a God. It is the counter to it. It's the denial of the truth of that. Not that there is or isn't any gods, but it's the denial of the truth of the proposition there are gods. And again, I might not have any beliefs about the existence of gods, but I might certainly deny, if there's insufficient reason to assert that there are gods, I certainly would be tempted to deny that proposition is true. And so anyway, yeah, that was one of the most important things in that paper.
Let's further the read. While identifying atheism with the metaphysical claim that there is no God, or that there are no gods, is particularly useful for doing philosophy, it is important to recognize that the term atheism is polysemous, and that it has various usages. It's not just looked at one way. That is, as is more than one related meaning, even within philosophy. And so within the scope and sequence of what philosophy is, philosophers are not always on the same page when it comes to the term. And so if just within the field of atheism the term is used differently, I think it would be fair to say to a lot of these fundamentalists in atheism, maybe back away from just one definition, realize that people talk about this term in many different ways. Would that be good, useful, or what?
I usually find it, rather than telling people what the correct definition is, because again, it has a lot of different meanings, what I want to do is use a term that someone understands what I mean by it. And when someone uses the term, I want to understand what they mean by it. The whole purpose of using labels is to shortcut a lot of back and forth to find out what somebody actually thinks. So that's the task of saying someone is a theist or an atheist. And I think in general, when it comes to, I think it's a good idea that Ozzy's coming forward with saying that there's lack theism, meaning someone may not have any ideas or beliefs about God, or even know that there's a God. That would be, or that there's a question of God. that would be a great word to use instead of saying there are only theists and atheists, because that assumes too many people under an umbrella that could be further distinct from the kind of atheism that lack theism is talking about. It's not, it would be unfair to identify as an atheist someone that's an agnostic. An agnostic, say like A.J. Ayer, makes fun of idiots that are atheists that take the question seriously. So he would, roll over in his grave thinking someone is calling him an atheist.
Right.
Bertrand Russell might have similar reactions to people's idea of what's passing these days for atheism versus what he meant by it, 100 years ago. So what's most important is not really ramming a definition down somebody's throat. It's that if we're going to engage in this conversation, when I use this term, here's how I mean it. And can you put aside your understanding and just adopt mine as long as I'm talking? That seems to be the most helpful way to proceed.
Okay, let me keep reading. For example, many writers at least implicitly identify atheism with a positive metaphysical theory like naturalism or even materialism. Given this sense of the word, the meaning of atheism is not straightforwardly derived from the meaning of theism. While this might seem etymologically bizarre, perhaps a case can be made for the claim that something like metaphysical naturalism was originally labeled atheism only because of the cultural dominance or non-naturalist forms of theism, not because the view being labeled was nothing more than the denial of theism. On this view, there would have been atheists even if no theist ever existed. They just wouldn't have been called atheists. And so, blah, 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 suggests this line of thought, though this his official definition is the standard metaphysical one. Although this definition of atheism is a legitimate one, it is often accompanied by fallacious inferences from the alleged provable falsity of atheism to the truth of probable truth of theism. And so would you speak about that briefly? Just touch on that a moment.
Briefly, I have some problems with it, but understand in general what the gist is, that that if we take atheism to be a lack of beliefs about God, which is what that's proposing, then there may be a case to say that, yeah, it's atheism really doesn't have anything to do with the proposition that there are gods. It would be the absence of any belief about God. That'd be hard to pull off, but I don't think it would be helpful. I don't think in reality we would talk about atheists that way. It's a theoretical model to speak that way. Yeah, I would just call somebody a naturalist if they're a naturalist, because it doesn't describe someone without a belief in gods. I'm a naturalist. I'm a materialist. But I also think that there's a God. So what you want labels to do for you is identify who you are, or at least the kinds of ideas that you associate immediately with, so that you can get on to more important things in a discussion quicker.
Okay. Now, these individuals have made the statement there is more than one correct definition of atheism. Would you agree with that?
I don't think in terms of correctness. There are different uses for the term atheism, and we ought to know the breadth and depth of all of those before we start talking about any one particular usage being the most available to some conversation. Now, when somebody says there's only one definition, then that's when we need to have the conversation like I was having yesterday and today on YouTube on our last video.
Okay, but this particular writer goes on to say the issue for philosophy is which definition is the most useful for scholarly or more narrowly philosophical purposes.
Well, In that case, the traditional winner has always been atheism is the denial of the proposition there are gods. There are gods is true is what would be the proposition on the table. And the belief that an atheist would have is that there are gods is true is false. And that's the particular way a epistemologist would talk about it, or philosopher in general, because it leaves out any particular commitments to attitudes other than just related to the proposition on the table. And then you can be very specific in focusing in on the problems with just that one proposition.
Okay. I'm going to cut to the chase because I want to bring in various people who do want to talk about this. We haven't had a long dialogue. But I think that we have sufficient data to deal with. So before we go to that conversation, let me ask you this question. I want you to do the best that you can to put on the table your best idea concerning, or should I say, the usage that you think is the most compelling usage of atheism. What makes sense to you, and theism and agnosticism, because let's pretend for the sake of argument that people need to understand these terms. What is atheism? What is theism? What is agnosticism?
Yeah, I'll do the safe thing, and I'll leave out personal attitudes and feelings, or not just, I don't mean my personal feelings, but anyone in general, their attitudes or dispositions. I'll leave that out and just approach all of them as a proposition. So I think a very common way to talk about theism is a general category of people that believe in the existence or reality of supernatural realities, put it that way. There's more than just this reality that we're experiencing. I think the denial of, well, there's a subset of theism would be the particulars. There's theism proper, which is belief in some kind of caring God, or one that's that it has some interest in creation. There's deism under that theistic umbrella too. And again, it wouldn't be improper at that point to say, well, atheism is similar, because it's a broad category of people that don't buy into just the proposition there are gods is true. If we're just speaking about propositions, it would be appropriate to say in the ballpark, everyone that denies the proposition, even if it's people that say the proposition isn't true or false because it's incoherent, or no one can know whether or not the proposition is true or false, they would be an atheist under the ballpark category. These people deny that the proposition is true. But again, depends on what you want to talk about and how particular you want to be about the language. Atheism, it makes the most sense to say atheism is the belief that the proposition there are gods isn't true. For agnostics, it would be that twofold on that, because the common meaning generally is what people associate with. But the formal meaning is it's an actual position that, given the description of God being supernatural, there's nothing that we can know about God in an epistemic sense. So you can't know even whether or not God exists, and that's all there is to it. The other way that people generally mean things, and it's really, it's absurd as far as I'm concerned, because I don't know anybody that's certain 100% of some proposition being true. And so that means that if there's any range of doubt, the term agnosticism would always be in play. So you would have people that are unsure of the veracity of some proposition. That's what some people think agnosticism is. But, you know, what use is it to say that, because it doesn't identify anybody in particular. It identifies everybody that's not 100% sure of any given proposition. So I could be an agnostic car driver, or I could be an agnostic theist, or an agnostic agnostic, whatever, you know, because I don't know any same person that's 100% sure about most of the stuff that they believe. There's apatheism, which is the most interesting thing to me because I would be a theist that's very apatheistic. I don't really care whether or not there's a God because it makes no material difference to my existence here and now, whether or not there is or is not a God. So as a theist, I don't care if there's a God. As an atheist, atheists shouldn't care if there's a God. It would be odd if they did because it would entail the belief that there might be a God. But again, there's that play of doubt. But those are some general terms and how I would use them. An agnostic, by the way, is somebody that just doesn't think that there's any sense in the proposition there are gods. It doesn't make sense because we don't know what we're talking about, or what if we did know what we were talking about, because God is outside of this reality and nothing like this reality, then all of our descriptions being natural cannot apply to God. So it's senseless to talk about God anyway. So those would be I'd say 4 or 5 major ways that people are approaching viewing different or embracing different ideas about God these days. And those would be how I would say that they're most meaningful.
I was ministering back in the late 70s or early 80s. And I'll never forget this event. It was actually in a bowling alley. It had been converted or repurposed as a church. Believe it or not, the place was packed. Had about 200 or 300 people outside. And it was the night in which things changed for me, because when I got up and I started ministering, and so many people gave their hearts and lives to Jesus Christ, I really didn't want that to happen, to be honest with you. I had made this point and people resonated with it because in my mind this made sense. Because in my theistic mind at that time, I simply got up and said, God is no more than the abstraction of the idea by which people have oriented themselves to produce a functional society. And that's what we're dealing with story. And so we do tend to, write fiction or narrative or mythology to have something that runs parallel to our reality. And so with what I said about God back in the late 70s or early 80s, my question to you would be, is that a part of theism or what?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. Preachers in seminary, particular seminaries especially, aren't going to agree with you. I think a lot of other theologians would.
Now, theologians agree with me, but you're right. Yeah. Other people in the educational process of Christianity, they would not agree with that. And when I said that, ministers got pissed, okay? But the lay people were, in a sense, turned on because this wasn't about a sky daddy or this ultimate Lord and Savior. And the only reason that people were giving their lives to Jesus, it would be probably equivalent to saying, I want to live the rest of my life like Martin Luther King did, Jr., in that I want to do something useful for humanity, because I've never been a preacher who articulated the gospel. I would teach different concepts of the gospel in order to get people to understand. People approach the gospel from various hermeneutics, various vantage points, if you will. I was led to believe that, or I thought that it would be a little bit more honest if we presented how different people look at the same book. And then when I started exegeting, that is, leading what's there out of the text, and then when I started suggesting that we really don't even have the sufficient data to do this in many cases, people started, getting upset. And so, even here more recently when I've done a handful of funerals, some of the things that I say really makes the ministers and the audience very uncomfortable, but the lay people enjoy it. It's setting them free. So I wanted to know your thoughts, and so I will repeat this once again. God is no more than the abstraction of the idea by which people have oriented themselves to produce a functional society. So with that, I really think that's true. Would that make me a theist, agnostic, or an atheist, or what say you? Come on.
You're a human being.
Hey, listen, I'm drinking tonight a little bit from my throat. My throat hurts and my blood pressure's way up. I need some help. What am I?
You're right, is what you are. It's God and Jesus. I mean, all you've got to do is look through the history of any given particular religion, and God is an ideal that is the trajectory of where we're already headed, but the enticement to keep going. And you'll find that. I mean, again, it's the entire history. You'll see Westboro people thinking one way about God versus Jesuits thinking it an entirely different way.
Right.
Well, there's something objective to that, other than we're employing our particular views of God and getting some kind of affirmation or hopefully, correction by applying what we think, or is it what you're just saying? It's an ideal that's what we already have in mind, but it's abstracted enough where it's something that's just outside of our reach. And every time we get closer enough to reach it, we redefine what God is or how it's supposed to have implications with our day-to-day life. I think you're absolutely right. Whether or not you're a theist or an atheist or anything else, I don't really care. I like talking to you.
Okay, let me put this on the table. I'm committed to a process, not a conclusion. That doesn't mean that I don't have conclusions, nor does it mean that I'm not working with them and through them. I'm just saying that my commitment is not to the conclusion itself. And so I find myself on this journey. And I used to be in love with my viewpoint. I'm no longer in love with my viewpoint. And to me, that's a breath of fresh air. I can kick back and revisit myself, if you will, trying to rethink. I was so indoctrinated, and yes, if there's an atheist out there who has compassion and some kind of empathy for me, I need it simply because with my experiences in theism, I don't know that I've gotten rid of all of my indoctrination. Because, once you feel like you're free, over the next 2 or 3 years, you discover, wow, I didn't get rid of, 100 to 200 other things that had me heavy laden, if you will. And so I really need some help. And so I'm crying out for atheists, theists, and agnostics alike to help me. And so this is the kind of show that we have tonight. And so those of you guys in the Hangout, welcome to the Hangout. I'm going to kick back, sip some stuff that's orange in color, and raise an orange pin because, I like, the blend. That looks good, doesn't it? Okay. Stephen, take it away.
Oh, I don't know that there's anything to take away. I thought you had great comments, Carrie, and all important concerns. So, and I see Jordan's here too. What do you want to talk about?
Hi. Speaking of what Michael was just mentioning about lasting effects of indoctrination or a culture we've left behind, I sometimes get that sense that there are lingering vestiges of the religion I used to have, and at the same time, many of the values I was raised with, I've hung on to because now I think that I have good reasons for having them. So at least I can. I think I appreciate some of what I was raised with more than I used to, but there's a lot of it that I'd still like to change. There are certain autonomic. I don't know if autonomic's the right word for it, but it's, feelings that I have that I can't help but have that I wish were different. I wish I had a little more self-love, for example. It's something that was not emphasized a whole lot, but at the same time, it was actually part of Jesus's message, I think, looking in hindsight, like love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. Like there were three parts to that whole thing, not two. And that's something I can still improve on. I still have a vestige of perfectionism where if I don't feel like I can do something well, then I'm discouraged from attempting it at all. And I see that influencing my decisions in a variety of circumstances.
If I might jump in for a moment, is my mic on?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me
You're
jump
loud
in
and
for a
clear.
moment. I think that we have Ozzy on the show tonight, and I want to welcome you. I have ultimate respect for you, and you know that we've been good friends for years. And I've really admired your work. I really think the conversation needs to become better. And I think that you're doing your best to better that conversation. And so jump in, Ozzy, at any time. I'm all ears tonight.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thanks for those kind words.
Hey, Ozzy, I'll just raise a mug to you.
And I stated earlier on Facebook that, it's dangerous to have Ozzy on because he's a god. And he may convert everyone over to theism because he is God. But putting that notion to the side, we'll sit back and listen. So what are your thoughts on what's being stated tonight, Ozzy?
Well, first, let me begin by saying I self-identify as a demigod. I almost didn't make it because I had these Herculean labors to take care of, but I got them taken care of. So there I am. My thoughts. Well, I'm of a mind with Stephen on this with respect to the various labels. I think that the traditional philosophical usage in the discourse within the philosophy of religion is the best way to proceed. I think the point is to sort of carve up the pie. There are people out there that have different beliefs with respect to the existence of a God, and when you ask a person a question like, "Do you think there's a God?" you want as direct an answer as they can give you. And if they say, "Yeah, I think there's a God," they don't have to know there's a God. They can just say, "Yeah, I think there's a God," and that makes them a theist. And if they think, "No, I don't think so. I don't think there's a God," then that makes them an atheist. And if they go, "I haven't made up my mind. I'm undecided," then that's what I call an agnostic. And that's traditionally what's been meant by agnosticism. Not that you don't know that there's a God, but that you're undecided on the question. You're just simply on the fence for whatever reason, either because you think the question is undecidable for everyone always, or because you think it's undecidable just by you right now, given the state of your understanding of the case for and against the existence of a God. And then there's another sort of complication you can throw in here, another category. This is sometimes called theological non-cognitivism or epistemivism, not epistemivism, but someone help me out here. I can't think of the word.
Atheism.
Thank you, atheism. Definitely not epistemivism. Atheism. Or
Thank you, Ozzy.
Thank you very much.
You're not going to argue for epistemivism, right?
I'm sorry, you broke up there. I didn't hear you.
Okay, you're not going to argue for epistemivism, correct?
No, I definitely would not. No, I would
Thank you.
not.
I didn't think you would.
Say I'm anti-epistivist, but although I appreciate why people want to call themselves epistivists, I think it's misguided. But anyway, so there's this fourth way to divide up the pie. So we're not thirding the pie now. You can sort of divide it up into quarters if you like. And the fourth quarter would be theological non-cognitivism or igtheism. And a theological non-cognitivist or an atheist is someone who thinks that the question of God's existence is literally meaningless. The discourse is so polluted and incoherent and confused that the question isn't really a question. It sounds like a question, right? Does God exist? But in fact, there's no there. And that's not to say that they think that there's no God. They think that talk of God is literally meaningless. And so when you say, is there a God, or if you say there is a God, or if you say there isn't a God, or if you say I'm undecided about the existence of God, they think that you're talking nonsense. All right? These are people who think that the question or the statement God exists or God exists not is as meaningful a question as what's the difference between a duck? It sounds like a question. It has the grammatical form of a question, but it's not really a question. It's not meaningful. So a theological non-cognitivist is someone who thinks the question of God's existence can't even be true or false. It's not truth apt. It does not. It's not that we can't decide on the question. It's not an epistemological problem. It's a semantic problem. It's meaningless. It's completely meaningless. It's just babble.
So, quick question: would you say
theists, on my view, but they wouldn't call themselves atheists because they think atheists are just as dumb as theists and agnostics and all this prattle about God.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
Is that primarily because of the fact that the term God has so many different variant meanings? Is that primarily where that's coming from?
That's one. There are some people who adopt that position for that reason, that there are so many competing conceptions of the divine that whenever two people are talking about God, because they're using the same word, they think they're talking about the same thing. But in fact, they are radically equivocating and have no idea what they're talking about. There is, in fact, no common ground between them. And so the discourse is meaningless. So that's one reason for being an atheist or theological non-cognitivist. There are other reasons, but they're along those lines that discourse is somehow polluted or so confused as to make it a discourse that has no domain. There's no proper domain of inquiry here. Again, they're not saying that there isn't a God. They're saying you can't get as far as saying there is no God. You can't get as far as saying there is a God. You can't get as far as saying I don't know if there's a God, because it's just noise. The word God is just a signifier without a signified. It doesn't signify anything. It's not that there isn't a referent out there in reality, that there isn't a God. It doesn't refer to anything, right? It's like if I say, a square circle. A square circle, that expression doesn't fail to refer, because there could be square circles and just so happens there aren't. Just like there could be a pink elephant in my room, but there isn't one. That statement is false. If there's a pink elephant in my room, there isn't one. But I mean, logically speaking, it's not a contradiction to say that there's a pink elephant in my room. But a square circle, that is literally meaningless, right? That isn't made false by some fact in the world. Okay, it is literally meaningless. What on earth is a square circle? It's literally not even non-existent. It's not even false, right? So that's how some theological non-cognitivists view the whole domain of discourse. And I've heard people actually in these hangouts here on NCG talk about God in ways that verge on that position. And I've actually heard theists talk about God in a way that is so ineffable, and they describe it as so incommunicable that they, in my view, are verging on theological non-cognitivism, but they describe themselves as theists. So anyway, that's how I sort of think it's best to sort of carve up the pie, is to define these terms or understand these terms in ways that help a person understand what is your position with respect to the God question. Right? Not merely do you lack a belief, because you can define you can define atheism as a mere lack of belief, but that's like defining theism as a lack of belief and the non-existence of God. You can define anything negatively, and it just doesn't tell a person. If I walked into this room and I said,
Ozzy, can you do me a favor? Restate that clearly again, because you made, that's a golden statement right there, because so many people are saying, I just lack belief. And you're saying that on the opposite side of the coin or the argument in theism, you could do the same thing. Would you state that again? Because I thought that was brilliant.
Sure. So when people try to define atheism as a mere lack of belief, the absence of a belief, that's fine. That's what we would call non-theism. You're a non-theist, right? On my view, a theological non-cognitivist is a non-theist, although the theological non-cognitivist would deny that. An agnostic is a non-theist. Okay, you can define anything negatively. So I can define atheism as the mere absence of the belief in theism. But a theist could come around and say, yeah, you know what? It's not so simple. I'm going to define theism as the lack of belief. I'm going to define it negatively. I'm not making a positive assertion here. I'm defining theism as the lack of belief in the non-existence of God. I mean, every theist lacks a belief in the non-existence of God, right? Right? Now, if you define theism that way, you've just defined theism negatively. Now it turns out that all the agnostics in the world, right, they too lack a belief in the non-existence of God because they don't believe in a God. They don't believe in the non-existence of God either. So now all of a sudden the agnostics fall under the heading of theism because you've defined it negatively. And if you define atheism negatively, then you can drag the agnostics under your own umbrella. And you can, so people sort of play tug of war with agnostics, everyone trying to subsume them under their own tent. But what's wrong with that position is well, first of all, it's just sort of an accident of our language that we define things a certain way. Very often, it's not important whether you define things positively or negatively, because anything can be turned into its negation, as I just demonstrated. You can define atheism and theism positively or negatively. There's no principled way here. But I mean, imagine if you asked me to, supposing you asked me, Ozzy, you know, what's your position? And I said, oh, I'm a non-agnostic. You're left wondering, what the hell? You're non-agnostic. What, are you a theist or an atheist or a theological non-cognitive? All you've told me is what you're not. You haven't given me an answer to the question, what's your position? Because the point of the nomenclature, of the terminology, is to find out what a person thinks is the case. What is their opinion on the matter being whether or not a God exists.
You know what this reminds me of, right?
That's why we define the terms the way we do traditionally, and that's why I endorse that traditional usage. Sorry, Jordan, go ahead. I didn't hear what you said there.
I was just going to say this reminds me precisely about how people tend to describe God in terms of what he isn't. Is he timeless, spaceless, immaterial? They're using these negative terms to attempt to say what he is, but they're really saying what he isn't, and therefore you're not really adding anything to his definition, I guess. And
subtracting qualities away from something, and allegedly this is going to somehow point to something, but it doesn't really work, does it?
Yeah, and that's something I try to get past when I want to know what someone thinks of God and what he is. I try to point that out to them. It's that it's not useful to just describe him in negative terms.
Now, one thing I noticed when Stephen was talking earlier, and I'll put the question to you, Stephen, and to you, Ozzy, and great to see you again. It's been a while. With the usage in a particular context, should we expect the man, the woman on the street to learn more about the formal aspects or semi-formal aspects of this sort of discussion when they might have neither the time nor inclination to do so? And as far as the usage, I note that it seems anyway that a lot of the atheists with whom I'm familiar are not so much trying to disprove a God as use that argument to try to counter the things that some theists will do with their belief in a God, or so they say. People like me should not exist because their God doesn't like me, or Democrats should not exist because their God doesn't like them. Should we call ourselves something else if that is what we are trying to do, and would we be understood?
We're anti-authoritarian. That's what it is.
Well, I've been that for 60 years.
Yeah.
Well, I think you had a couple of questions in there. The first one was, should we hold laymen accountable to the terms that they use, but in a different context, one that they're not familiar with? I think that was the gist of the first question. The answer is no, as far as I'm concerned. However, again, when we're having these sorts of conversations, it becomes a social concern. So if someone, I have an interest in some occasions where somebody is asserting something, and that makes a difference, what it is that they're asserting. Well, my interest creates an obligation, a responsibility between myself and that other person, and I try to be forthright with explaining any problems that I think might exist with what it is they're saying, and then tell them why it's important. I think those are the key points that matter in having any conversation at all. But if someone is asserting that I have no belief, and that's then my question, I lack a belief in God, as Ozzy's saying, and everyone else in philosophy is saying. There's problems in saying that because you're not describing anything, and that's the job of labels. If you lack a belief, it's just simply not true. What you believe as an atheist is that it's not true that the proposition there are gods is true. You're denying the truth of a proposition that exists. You're not ignorant of a proposition. And if you deny the proposition itself, you are already agreeing that that sentence makes sense in some way. So you're not an atheist, and you're not apathetic. You care about the question and how we answer it. So your belief is that it's not true. And so when we encounter people, particularly atheists, that say, well, I don't have any beliefs at all, it's really historically been, I don't have beliefs, therefore I don't have to justify myself to you. That's what it boils down to. And that's a bad way to approach conversations, especially ones that matter most. So the honest thing to do is say, I don't think there's a God if you don't think there's a God. And we can do without the labels, because a conversation can ensue from there. And your dispositions, even though they may classify really well or identify or associate with atheism really well, you still might not think that that's a good identifier for you. And we would want to discuss what it is that you actually believe. And that's the most important thing about having a conversation, is understanding each other. So no, I'm not going to hold you to a philosophical understanding of what I mean by justification or truth or God or whatever. I'm going to try and understand you on your terms, and I'm going to try and say that there are or are not difficulties with the ideas that we're sharing together, and then give you really good reasons to maybe broaden how it is that you're approaching the topic.
Okay, that's pretty good right there. I don't mind that at all. And then the other thing is that, as I say, what I'm hearing a lot of vocal atheists, as I've heard them described, saying is not so much primarily, I don't believe in a God, although many of them do. Rather, I don't like what you're using your God to do to other people. I don't know if there's a way to get that point across better, or am I even making sense?
Well, you're making sense, and I think that you're pointing to the motivation that many critics of religion and atheists have. But the point of the jargon or the terminology, as I said earlier, is to
Did we lose them?
I think we lost the audio of Ozzy.
Ozzy appears to have frozen.
Right?
Yeah, and he was just about to
He
reveal.
was just at the good stuff.
Could any of you guys see that? If you turn to a pillar of salt.
Yeah, on my thumbnail, he is definitely Ozymandias halide.
Stephen, pick up the slack here. Go for it.
Well, I don't know exactly where he was going, but Yeah, the ethical side is usually, with my experience of talking with thousands of atheists over the past 15 years or so every day, is a concern is not necessarily, they generally could care less what you believe, but there's if you're believing something, right, then you're acting in accordance with those ideas. And there's where the problem comes in. Because what people are saying that they believe about God, they're saying it has a referent that there's this God and all these comments apply to. And because they apply to this God, then the rules that I'm saying are coming from God matter, and you can go to hell because this is what I know about God. Well, this is where it becomes really important to talk about justification and your grounds for saying things, because there's a consequence for the beliefs that we hold. So yeah, the atheists could really care less, except for that feature of Christians and Muslims that are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is living out what they think their beliefs are. So, the justification, the proper conversation for me, as far as I'm concerned, isn't about whether or not you think there's a God or what you think about God. It's whether or not what you believe is compelling you to do, and whether or not what you are doing is appropriate to be done in a human society. And there's where we could spend most of our time talking about things that matter, is just the ethical implications of how we ought to act as people. And we can be atheists and do that, as far as my experience goes, we can do that better as atheists most of the time than we can as theists, because we are necessarily not relying on anybody else's telling us what is moral and what's not. You have to think through, or you should be thinking through every action that you take and measuring it just a little bit more than what you might be if you're sitting in a pew, somebody else is telling you how the cow ate the cabbage. Anyway, Ozzy's back. Take it.
Ozzy's
buddy.
back. Yay! We
Yeah.
lost you there for a minute. It's so good to have you back. Prodigal Ozzy? Is that?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. My wife-
Perhaps we could call this the second coming.
Oh dear. As long as there's no crucifixions in my future, I'm content.
There you go.
Yeah, so Diana, to address your point earlier, I hope we haven't moved on from there, but the point of the nomenclature, as I said before, I think is to get people to, in a word or two, state what their position is, not their reasons why, just what their position is on the God question. And the question that you're talking about here is sort of motive, what motivates a lot of atheists. A lot of atheists in these discussions are motivated by trying to get theists to justify their beliefs, and they rightly recognize that in order to get another person to give reasons for why they believe what they do, to justify their position, you shouldn't have to justify the opposing position. I should be able to ask you, what's your position, and what are the reasons for it, without having to state my own, right? That's not necessary. You don't need me in the room to justify your own position. So if a person asks you to, why do you believe in a God, you should just be able to say, if you believe in a God and why you believe in it. And you shouldn't have to, it shouldn't be assumed that you automatically take the opposite position. You might not. You could be a theist asking another theist, do you believe in God and why? Right? And I'm an atheist.
Absolutely.
I think that there's no God. And I often ask atheists if they think there's no God and why. And it would be wrong of them to assume, well, you must be a theist, Ozzy, if you dare to ask me that. You can ask that question, right? So I think a lot of atheists are motivated or attracted to this idea of lack theism, of defining their position negatively, so that they don't ever speak the words, I think there's no God. Because they know that the moment they do that, they have stated a position, and then they too will be asked to justify their position. But I think that's playing hide the ball with your position. I think the best thing to do in a circumstance like that is to say, well, as a matter of fact, I don't think that there's a God. And we can talk about my position if you like later, but right now we're talking about your position, and my positions are relevant to your reasons, right? So, please justify, in other words, nobody gets off the hook of having to justify their own position just because you've stated yours, right? there isn't one person in a room that has a burden of justification. There's many burdens of justification in a room as there are positions in the room. Everyone has his or her own burden of justifying their beliefs. And so I think it's a mistake when atheists do this, when they play hide the ball with their position and try to disguise their position by subsuming it under an umbrella that includes potted plants and house cats and people who've never heard of gods and newborns. And I think that's a mistake. It's a miscalculation. It makes them look weak. When the thing to do is to say, listen, all I did was ask you why you think there's a God. I'd like an answer to that. Maybe another time we can talk about my atheism, or we can talk about it at the same time as we talk about your theism, but that's going to be two conversations at once. It's going to be complicated. How about we just do one at a time, right? Or you can just, say, we'll talk about my position, and then we'll talk about yours. You can negotiate these things. But another motivation that you alluded to was that people are sometimes outraged by the things that people say and do and opine in the name of their gods, right? But that, I think, is irrelevant to how you describe your own position, right? If you find, there are certain dogmas of religions that I find just execrable. I just find them hideous, okay? And I make no bones about it. I'm happy to say what dogmas I find disgusting and dehumanizing and insulting to human dignity. And I'm willing to have that argument. I don't have to disguise my own position with respect to the existence of a God. So it just seems to me that the whole lacktheism and defining atheism as mere non-theism is irrelevant to your criticisms of a religion. If you're an anti-theist, if you think that most religions are bad, or on balance they're worse, it's worse having them around than not, and you wish that they would disappear, they would go extinct over time, if that's your view, that they need to be stamped out, then that's your view. That's anti-theism. But maybe you should describe yourself as an anti-theist. Christopher Hitchens used to describe himself as not merely an atheist, but in addition to that, he was an anti-theist, right?
Yes, I'm asking these things because I'm trying to refine my methods. I'm becoming more vocal as time is going on, especially within the last, let's say, 3 months or so. And I'm really trying to refine this to have a good position from which to work. And I'm thanking you for what you're saying, because I think I'm going to, if it happens that I haven't already, I'm trying to incorporate that into what I'm about. So thank you again.
Thanks for the question.
Ozzy, since you're here, I'd like to ask you this question. It's a bit off topic, but not too far. Jonathan Haidt wrote this, or actually responded to the question, what do you believe? He said, I believe that while there is no God or external intelligence, I believe that we humans do better when we can orient ourselves around common goals, common purposes, common ideals. I believe that our brains evolved with culture so that we have religious brains that are designed to be immersed in religious cultures. In other words, religion is not a trick or a disease, as Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett tell us. Religion is an adaptation. It's one that we have freed ourselves in some ways, and then we're puzzled as to why most of our fellow citizens, at least in the United States, cling to it. So I believe that in our community of liberal secular scientists, we will not progress. We will not understand the true nature of society until we open up our minds, especially to religious ideas. Not that there is a God, but that religion is adaptive. Our brains are built for it. And if we were going to find ways to live with both religious diversity and to make a space for atheists like me, we need to understand what religion does and what are some of the workable alternatives to it. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm very much in agreement with Haidt on this. Religion isn't going anywhere. Religion is a human thing. Now, some people like to conclude that because religion is effectively universal, culturally speaking, and it arises spontaneously and independently in different cultures, it's actually hard to eradicate, that this must be because it's pointing to something that's true. But I think that the functionalist account that Jonathan Haidt gives explains quite fully why religions exist. I mean, even think of the word religion. Actually, the word religion, right? Religio. I mean, that legio. It's Latin. It's where we get the word ligature and ligament. It's something that connects. It's connective tissue. It's that which binds, right? Religio is the thing that ties things together, the thing that binds, right? And that's what religions do. They bind us together. Now, religion is not the only thing that will do this. You know, politics will do this. Art can do this, but there's all kinds of things that can bind us, and it's not just religion. It is ultimately what I think binds us are sacred values, things that we take to be of ultimate importance to us. And there's an awful lot of overlap in the world in terms of what binds us. It's not a coincidence that religions are so similar, because religions, I think, address deep, deep human interests and deep, deep human concerns. And so that religion, if we wiped it out, if you could just press a button and wipe out people's brains, and so that just every thought that they have about religion just disappeared and every holy book just evaporated, it would not take more than a generation before religion spontaneously arose independently all over the world. So religion isn't going anywhere. It's here with us. I think they're false, but they serve a function. And I think understanding Haidt's position on this is important. We need to understand the function that religion serves, because one of the things that keeps people clinging to religion, even when they don't actually believe the literal doctrines of their faith, is they see the value in it. They see the service that it provides, the function that it offers, both at an individual level and collectively in our societies. And they fear what will happen if religion were to disappear. And to some degree, that fear is properly motivated. When a religious vision disappears from a culture, certain values often disappear with it. And that can leave a vacuum where people can just sort of end up valuing all the wrong things or not valuing things together, and so things aren't getting done. The glue, the ligature, the thing that binds us can sort of be loosened, and we stop being bound together. So I'm very, very sympathetic to Haidt's view on this. But I think it's a mistake when people try to point to the universality of religion and the good functions that it serves, that it is indispensable, and that religion must somehow be true, that there's something right about it. I think there's something fundamentally useful about it. We're social animals, we're not spiders, and religions serve a function.
In Jonathan Haidt's book, The Religious Mind, he stated, "I concluded by warning that the worship of reason, which is sometimes found in philosophical and scientific circles, is a delusion. It is an example of faith in something that does not exist. I urged instead a more intuitionist, I can't even pronounce the word tonight, forgive me, approach to morality and moral education, one that is more humble about the abilities of individuals and more attuned to the context and social systems that enable people to think and act well." Would you agree with that?
Partly. I think that there is a tendency among atheists and people in the skeptical movement to valorize reason and to have, frankly, overly optimistic attitudes about the benefits that will result from everyone becoming more open-minded and critical and rational. I think Haidt is correct that we're not particularly rational people. We run a lot more on intuition than on reason, but I don't think that that's a good thing. That's just the way it is. And I think you cannot point to any culture or civilization that can be accused of having been too rational. You can point to all kinds of regimes that have purported to be very, very rational and done all kinds of things in the name of reason, but it's very often easy to see the irrationality in those cultures, sometimes with disastrous consequences, murderous consequences on enormous scales. So I think that he's right that people tend to valorize reason an awful lot and have a kind of naive optimism in the force of reason. But I think he's wrong in denigrating it to the degree that he does. And I think he's at odds with himself, given where he works and what he does for a living. So I think reason is sort of the best way forward. We want to apply our reason everywhere that we can, but that doesn't mean that you have to be some kind of bloodless, cold, calculating automaton or Spock-like, right? As Hume said, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions. We have passions, we have basic biological imperatives and interests, and those generate all kinds of subsequent sub-concerns, if you like, and those are our basic motivations, and they furnish us with our most basic values, and reason works in service of those. And reason can allow us to sort of reflect back on the things that we value fundamentally and ask, maybe we're wrong to value some of these things. Maybe some of these things are in conflict with other values that we hold. So I think that I'm going to remain a proponent and advocate of skepticism and rationality, because it seems to me that we're in very short supply of it, present company included.
I get that. However, he made some points, and I don't know whether he was just trying to nuance a point or not, but he said reasoning can take us to almost any conclusion we want to reach because we ask, can I believe it? When we want to believe something, but must I believe it when we don't want to believe it? The answer is almost always yes to the first question and no to the second. And so, in this book, he's exploring, something well outside of what I would call, just something resting upon one axis. And so what are your thoughts here? I don't think that he's trying to denigrate reasoning, but he's trying to give it a sense of balance, if you will.
Well, if that's his goal, then of course I agree. And of course he's not an anti-rationalist, and he's not a romantic or anything like that. So when I say denigrating reason, I don't mean that he has no place for it and and wants to see it suppressed or anything like that. On the contrary, he'd be at odds with himself and his own enterprise, professionally and academically. And he's right when he says that people don't ask, is it true or is it false? What they ask is, if they believe it and they hear an argument against what they believe, they will then ask, well, must I believe this objection? And in the converse, if they hear an argument in support of their position, they just ask, oh, can I believe this? They don't ask if must I believe it, right? So it's basically he's pointing to the fact of motivated reasoning. We all engage in motivated reasoning. And so when he says that reason can be used to justify any conclusion, that's true. You can justify any conclusion. You just have to study logic. All you have to do is say, this is the conclusion I'm going to try to get to, and then try to confect as many premises as you can that point in that direction, right? That's an exercise in critical thinking, actually. That's one of the things you teach in a critical thinking course, is to get people to, this is a trick. I mean, I used to use this trick when I was a teaching assistant and I had undergraduate students. I'd say, okay, we'll look at a certain question. We would look at a question like abortion or a question like euthanasia or something like that. And I'd say, okay, raise your hand if you're in favor of euthanasia. Raise your hand if you're against it. Okay. And it's okay, well, you're all going to do a paper on this. Right? And then I would say, but you over there, you're going to do it on this, and you over there are going to do it on that. And this and that were the opposite of the positions that they held. And when you encourage people to try to argue against their own position, and it kind of matters, as it does in something like a term paper, they can sometimes discover how hard it is to generate reasons for something that they find unpalatable. and how easy it is to find reasons in support of the position that they already agree with, right? But that's part of what it is to teach critical thinking, and in part, or to model critical thinking for people, is to get people to recognize motivated reasoning in themselves where it takes place. But that's an exercise in reason. The only way you can counter motivated reasoning is to have an understanding of the limits of reasoning. I mean, epistemology isn't just about how do we know what we know. It's when we don't know something, why don't we know it? What are the limits of knowledge? What, epistemologically speaking, what kind of limitations must we operate within, right? One of the things I like about philosophy and epistemology in particular is it teaches you some intellectual humility and honesty, but especially humility. You find out just how little you know, and when you think you know something or when you believe something, how weakly, how guardedly sometimes you have to state your position. So in my view, Haidt is correct in pointing out that we engage in motivated reasoning, but there's only one reason to point out that fact, and that's that we hope that people will exercise their reason and recognize what a liability motivated reasoning is. Right? You're not going to be able to do anything except exercise your reasoning to work against your own cognitive biases. There's nothing else to do, is to just try to train your mind, right? And it's an ongoing process. We're all engaged in it. And you get better at it with practice and having good models and reading works like The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah, the reason that I'm talking about this idea of Jonathan Haidt trying to find some sense of balance, and I think that you can speak to this because you have this incredible background both in psychology and philosophy. But he said the first principle of moral psychology would be intuitions come first. Then he continues. He said strategic reasoning second. To demonstrate the strategic functions of moral reasoning, I review 5 areas of research showing that moral thinking is more like a politician searching for votes than a scientist searching for truth. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, he also uses another analogy. He talks about the elephant and the rider, and the passions are the elephant, and reason is the rider. Right. I mean, you can direct an elephant if you're riding an elephant, but if the elephant decides it wants to go where it wants to go, there's nothing that the rider sitting atop the elephant can do except just go along for the ride. And
Bob Graves and I were talking about that the other day. It was something that we were going to do a show on. We found that to be fascinating. Go ahead.
Yeah, and this is, of course, a very old idea. It dates back to Plato. Plato, the student of Socrates, describes the condition of the soul as, it's basically the condition, the tripart conception of the soul. I won't get into all of it, but the idea is that there were the passions that were like the horses, and reason is the charioteer trying to keep the horses on course, right? But I prefer the horses and chariot analogy to the elephant because if you're not a good charioteer, if you have not trained your horses, if you haven't thought about the art of charioteering and the art of horsemanship, then you're going to be led by the horses just as much as you would be led by an elephant if you were sitting atop it. Okay. In other words, if you don't learn critical thinking and practice this sort of thing, and come to understand some basic epistemology and our psychological limits and epistemological limits, you are always going to be sitting atop an elephant, and all of your reasoning, however fine it is always going to be in service of the elephant, of your passions, right? And you'll never be able to look back and go, wait a minute, is this what I want? Is this in fact in service of other passions that I have? Or am I at odds with myself? And so I like the charioteer example because you don't just hop aboard a chariot and pull on the reins and say, whoa, and then you stop, or just pull on one rein and you go that way. It's an art. You have to learn. You have to train your horses. And so training your mind to be more reasonable is not just a matter of deciding to be reasonable. It's not a matter of just deciding. It's know-how. It's learning things like fallacies. It's doing certain kinds of exercises of the sort that I described earlier that allow you to recognize cognitive biases when they're operative and how to combat them. In other words, it's a kind of cognitive or epistemological virtue. This sort of ties in with my view of virtue-based ethics, but I think that being rational is an ideal. No one actually achieves it. It's an ideal that we are in service of, and everyone who believes anything is in the business of caring about the truth. To have a belief, to think that something is true, is to have a stake in it being true. The truth matters. I know it's sort of unfashionable in some quarters to say this, but everyone cares about the truth, right? To quote Sam Harris, nothing is more sacred than the facts. That's why we get so upset when people present facts that conflict with what we think. It's because we are, in fact, all of us fully invested privately and socially, intersubjectively. We're invested in the facts. They matter to us. And you have to sort of train yourself to be more dispassionate and to reflect upon your beliefs. And if you don't engage in that, if you don't make a habit of that, if you don't practice that, you will always be engaging in instrumental reasoning. That is, you will always be reasoning in service of a conclusion that you like. You will always be a slave of your own passions. You will never be able to turn reason back upon itself, upon the master, upon the passions, and look and go, is this really how I ought to be reasoning? Is this really what I ought to be valuing? It is possible to do that with reason. It's massively hard. You know, it's like learning math, right? And it's like learning how to write. It's not like learning to speak, right? Learning to speak, everyone just learns to speak. You just expose to language and you speak. You just grow up speaking. If your brain is normal, if you're a neurotypical, you grow up with language around you, you learn how to speak. But that's not how you learn how to write. You have to be sat down in front of a teacher, in front of someone who knows how to write for unnaturally long periods of time. You're told to keep still and stare at something and practice writing something or typing over and over and over again until you learn the alphabet, and you learn simple words, and you learn punctuation and grammar, and it's work. It's labor. And I think some people despair of how hard it is, and just say, you know what, reason, it's just a great big old tool of propaganda. It's just another form of propaganda. It's just a way of crowbarring other people into thinking the way you think and valuing what you value. But I don't think that's true. I think it is, in fact, quite more than that. It's incredibly hard.
Okay, you keep talking about truth, and I want you to put something on the table, and I want to bring Stephen Hoyt back in, because we were talking about, in brief, last week I think it was, theories of truth. And so what are your thoughts on correspondence theory of truth, coherence theory of truth, consensus model of truth, deflationary theory of truth, and so on? I mean, where are you in the landscape of truth? I mean, what is truth? I keep saying things like, I have a perspective of truth, not truth itself. That's more of a poetic way of saying something. But what say you, Ozzy?
Okay, well, there's a huge can of worms.
Okay. Hello.
Well, I'm also mindful that there's a lot of other people in the room who need to get in here and say some things. But okay, let me try to be as brief as I can on the subject of truth. Truth and facts aren't the same thing. I subscribe to what's called the correspondence theory of truth. Okay. Now, the correspondence theory of truth is saddled with some very, very big problems, and I'm aware of those problems. But in the face of those problems, I persist in my belief that the correspondence theory of truth is correct, which is kind of weird, right? The correspondence theory of truth is correct, but truth is at the bottom of everything. I mean, when you are evaluating theories of truth, what are you doing? You want to know which theory of truth is true, which theory of truth, and then, well, but what do you mean by truth there, right? You want to know which theory is true, which theory is accurate, which theory is correct. Those are all cognate terms for truth. So I think that truth is when a proposition corresponds to a state of affairs, okay? Now, it'd be like a whole show on what we could possibly mean by corresponds here, but the best analogy I can give is map and territory, okay? Facts are truth makers. Facts aren't the truth. This is a cup. Here's a mug. I'm holding a mug here in front of me, a coffee mug, okay? Now, if I say the following proposition, this is a mug in my hand, okay? What I am trying to impart there, with the point of that sentence, is that I'm pointing to a state of affairs in the world. That proposition is it's a constative utterance. Not every utterance is constative, but constative utterance, statements, okay, purport to be about the world. And what makes them true is something in the world, a state of affairs. So if there is in fact a mug in my hand, then the statement, there is a mug in my hand, is true. Right? The facts aren't true. The facts are what make propositions true. So what is truth? Truth is a two-term relational property between a proposition and a state of affairs, such that the proposition describes the state of affairs. Now, that almost seems too obvious put that way. It almost seems too obvious, but I think truth is obvious. I think that the reason I like the correspondence theory of truth is because while there are theories of truth that get around some of the objections and obstacles to the correspondence theory of truth, none of those theories actually align very well with our intuitions about what we mean by truth. So when I say that I favor this theory of truth, I think that the theory of truth is correct. What I'm saying is, it's a semantic argument. The correspondence theory of truth best captures our intuitions about what we're trying to communicate. That's why I favor the correspondence theory of truth over other theories of truth. I mean, I think that's about as brief as I can be on the subject, and I know there's some big holes there.
Okay, but before you go on, I want to ask this question because, we do have a truth maker theory of truth, but you're using truth maker in the sense that is under the umbrella of correspondence, correct?
Yeah, well, what I mean by a truth maker is that which makes a proposition true, right?
Right.
So,
because, there's a truth maker theory of truth, which suggests, you have a truth bearer, therefore you have a truth maker. And a lot of people like Cy Tim Bruggencate and Eric Hovind and these kind of guys, they go, if you have a moral code maker and blah, blah, blah. And that's where they go with that. And so I'm trying to be clear as to what you're saying.
Yeah, well, without sort of invoking the names of other theories that might muddy the waters here, what I mean is this. Facts can't be true. It doesn't make sense to say this mug is true.
Right.
There are things about the mug that I could say that are true, but mugs can't be true. Okay? Mugs exist, and that statement is true. But what have I just pointed to there? I've just pointed out that it is statements about states of affairs that can be true. Statements can be true. Why? Because they express propositions, and propositions can be true. Beliefs can be true. Why? Because beliefs can be expressed as statements containing propositions that can be true. So statements can be true, sentences can be true, propositions can be true, beliefs can be true. Okay, those are the things that are truth bearers. They are candidates for truth. They can be true or false. Okay, but the things in the world, they just are, and they can make propositions true or false. And so that's what I mean by correspondence. And I don't know how far we want to go down this rabbit hole, but if we want to get into correspondence, the best analogy I can give is map and territory. When you're talking about correspondence, you're talking about a relationship between a proposition and a state of affairs. Just like there is a relationship of correspondence between a map and the territory that the map is supposed to describe, right? Now the map can be wrong, right? it can fail to describe, in which case that would be like analogous to a false proposition or a false statement. And an accurate map, in some respect, would be like an accurate statement within a belief set. So think of your entire belief set, everything, the set of all things that you believe, explicitly and implicitly, as a vast map of reality. You don't walk around just walk around the world with direct access to the facts. No, your access to the facts is mediated by your map. It's as if we were walking around in the world and we had a map in front of us and we couldn't look over the map because the map takes over your entire field of vision. And you're walking around, okay, there's a lake over here, okay? Oh, there's a tree over here, bump, and you stop. And and if your map is wrong, you're gonna drown, you're gonna walk off a cliff, you're gonna bump into trees, and things are gonna go wrong if your map is wrong. But consequently, your map is revisable. And you can change it, okay, when it generates false predictions. So there is a functional, pragmatic component built into the idea of correspondence. A lot of people think that you've got to, if you're a correspondence theory, you've got to be a naive correspondence theorist, and there can't be a pragmatic component to it. And I know that Stephen is a pragmatist with respect to truth, if I recall correctly. But I think there is a pragmatic component built into the very idea of correspondence. And there are tests that allow us to revise our maps. So there are criteria for revision, but all that is to say that you can revise your map such that it is now more functional than before. You never know if your map is ultimately accurate, just like you never know if all of your beliefs or any particular belief is ultimately accurate, right? Any one of my beliefs could be wrong. I doubt very much that all of my beliefs are wrong. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten as far in the world as I have. I probably wouldn't be breathing right now if that were the case. So if you think of correspondence as on the analogy of a map and a territory, I think you'll have a sort of an intuitive grasp of what we mean. Now, let me mention a sort of a shortcoming of this correspondence notion. What is the nature of the correspondence? Right? When you say that one thing corresponds to another, you're imagining what we call a mapping function. This is to that, as that is to this. What the hell is there in a proposition that maps to reality? Right? How does this picturing relationship work? This is something Wittgenstein was interested in his picture theory of language in the Tractatus. And that, I confess, is completely mysterious. I really don't know how better to characterize the mapping function than to simply appeal to the concept of a map. I think the content of the contentfulness of that analogy or that metaphor is precisely how functional it is, how functional a map is. We all know, if you've used maps, you know how useful that they are. Even if you used Google Maps while driving or something like that, you know how useful maps are. But if you've been out in the bush like I do and you go out with a map and a compass and you're trying to figure out where you are using your map, believe me, it's very, very hard sometimes to correlate a feature on the map with a feature in the world, right? Now, there's another problem with the correspondence theory, and that is, in the map analogy, we have an understanding that there's this thing in the world, the territory, that you can check against the map. And you can look at the two independently. You can look at the world, right? You can literally see the world, and you can literally see the map, and you can say, well, wait a minute. The map here says there's a lake here, and I'm standing in sand, and there's no lake. So something's wrong. Either the lake has dried up and left beach sand here, or there never was a lake here, and this is just a big sand dune, and the map is wrong, okay? Not just wrong now, but deeply wrong, okay? When it comes to maps and territory, there's this ocular metaphor, right? There's this, this capacity to look at the map and look at the territory, and that's what makes the correspondence between the two. So we understand the nature of the correspondence there, okay? But in the correspondence theory, really all you've got is this hypothetical posit called the world, the mind-independent reality, that you can't just see, because you have to look through the map. There's only the map to look to. And why? Because in the correspondence theory, the map is your beliefs, right? In other words, we navigate through the world with our beliefs, okay? And I'm operating in the world through my beliefs, including my perceptual beliefs, for instance, that I see a tree or I don't see a tree or I see a lake or whatever. And so if I have a belief that if I keep walking, I'm going to be neck deep in water, and then instead I fall off a cliff, I discover through a perceptual belief, I'm falling. I discover that my map was wrong. I discovered that another belief was wrong. So there's a kind of breakdown in the idea of correspondence. It's almost like a primitive concept in the theory, this notion of correspondence. We don't know how to analyze or break down the concept of correspondence. We always have to use things like the map and territory analogy, and that's about the best that we can do with correspondence theory. But the reason, in spite of these fairly significant problems with correspondence theory, and that's just like one or two of them, in spite of these, I cling to the correspondence theory because it seems to me that's what we think we're talking about when we're talking about truth. When people use the word truth and false, that's what they're talking about. People think they're talking about the world. They think they're talking about states of affairs in the world. And they think that there are states of affairs in the world that make their beliefs true, or that make it the case that their beliefs are either true or false. And the best analogy that we have for this is correspondence between something like a map and a territory. And that's why I subscribe to the correspondence theory. I think it best captures our linguistic intuitions and all of the related concepts, epistemic concepts having to do with truth and falsity.
Okay, we have a gentleman by the name of Thomas Aquinas. He presented, I would say, a metaphysical version that I think that may be something similar to what you're suggesting. He said that truth is the equation of thing and intellect. He restated that a little bit later, as a judgment is said to be true when it conforms to external reality. Proclus, and I'm getting a feedback here, but let me finish my point. He said Proclus, I mean, he didn't say Proclus. Jack, why am I getting a feedback? Someone has something open on Google which would do that. Please, everyone mute, except for me and Ozzy right now, and then I want to bring Stephen in. But Proclus said, he speaks of truth as an agreement or an adjustment between knower and the known. Let me go on. Others have emphasized that truth is neither in the things or states of affairs themselves, nor in the statement itself, but lies in the agreement between the two. But back to Aquinas' statement, he said that, you know, that explanation that he gave was very, very limited to judgment and thought when it comes to truth. He said, in other words, you can't take it too far. I mean, is that where you're at, or similar to?
Well, I'm certainly in agreement with Aquinas there on in the part that you quoted, and it's reminiscent. I mean, it's not a coincidence that it's reminiscent of Aristotle. He was massively inspired by Aristotle. And I mean, Aristotle's view was, I can't remember exactly how he said it. He said something like, to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is the true. And to say of what is that it is not, and of what is not that it is the false. Right? That, I think, really captures what we mean by truth. And Aquinas was saying the same things, although he was saying it a little bit more explicitly in terms of a relationship, right? So I think truth is a relationship. It's a relationship not between us and the world, but a relationship between the content of a proposition and a state of affairs.
Now, when Aristotle was dealing with truth in this context, he actually argued in the context of speaking about truth and tying it to our understanding of knowledge, and you might be able to drill down on this. He said not all knowledge is demonstrative. That is, not all knowable is, or all knowledge is based upon an argument from other things known, and that some knowledge must be independent of demonstration. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I actually would agree with that, although probably not for the same kinds of reasons that he would have. But knowledge is a completely different question. I mean, let's not get confused here about what I'm saying. when I say that there's such a thing as truth, and that truth consists of a correspondence relationship between a proposition and the world, I'm not saying that on the basis of that, you can decide and figure out what is true and what isn't true. This is not a decision procedure. This is not a verification procedure, right? The correspondence theory of truth is not an account of how to arrive at true beliefs. It's an account of what we mean by truth, right? What are we talking about? You know, before you can generate a theory of knowledge and a verification procedure for deciding what is true and what is false, you first have to have some grip on what we mean by truth, what we're talking about. And so that's how I proceed. Now, Stephen's laughing here because he's a pragmatist. He thinks those questions aren't separable. And he thinks that one of those questions is not logically prior to the other, that they're entangled in one another. And I think that they are logically separable. But anyway.
Stephen, jump in, provide some pushback if you can.
Yeah, well, I don't think you've described, put it as well as I can. I don't think you've described correspondence at all, because what you're saying is of course there's this intuition about how we talk, and then there are conditions that I think everyone would agree that what we're trying to do with our sentences when we talk about states of affairs is that we're trying to be descriptive of those states of affairs in a useful way. And how do we know those are useful ways but to experience whatever it is that we're saying? There's no reason to talk about the word truth, because what we're talking about at that point is simply utility and whether or not it's appropriate to talk a certain way. So when we talk about what best captures our intuitions, well, we don't argue that this sentence is true because it corresponds. What we say is here are the justifications that imply that this is the best thing to say about reality. So that's a pragmatic view, not a correspondence theory view. And when you're talking about how do we correct these things, well, I'll say probably that there are sentences that are just true. They're ontologically true, or in some aspect independent of our saying so, that this is descriptive of the world in a way that's beyond any linking between me and the sentence, but it's more a linking between the sentence and the world. We can say that that's one way we can talk about correspondence, but in reality, that's not what we mean, because again, we argue for what corresponds and why. If there were a function, then maybe we'd have a way of saying that it matters calling a sentence corresponding to reality versus useful way to talk about reality. But in reality, we don't have any kind of linkage between a sentence and the world except for utility and what makes sense to say. So that's in listening to all these things, you're coming up with the reasons why it's important not to embrace the idea, because it doesn't really get at our how we work and how we talk and what we mean by truth. Of course, people mean by truth that our sentences are saying are actually in some way in touch with reality in a way that's beyond people. That's an intuition that's simply mistaken. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to justify what we say and say here's why it links up and how. But again, that's a method of justification. It has nothing to do with talking about correspondence. So again, that's a pragmatic view. There's no difference from saying a sentence is true than to say this sentence is assertable because it's justified. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but I disagree. I agree with just about everything you said insofar as we're talking about justification and conditions of public assertability, which I think is pragmatic through and through. In fact, you might have probably heard me say at some point that I reject JTB, the justified true belief definition of knowledge, because I don't think that justification is a condition on knowledge. And what I mean by that is I don't think that the J in JTB, justification, is an ingredient in knowledge. It serves a pragmatic function, but it's not part of the definition of knowledge. I subscribe to something called reliably produced true belief. I think that something like JTB and RTB are not supposed to provide verification conditions or decision procedure for determining when we know things and how we know things. These competing theories like RTB and JTB and others are merely supposed to characterize how we use words like knowledge, okay? and capture the pattern of attribution and retraction of knowledge claims. But justification is a whole other animal, and I think justification is absolutely indispensable, but it's not indispensable as part of the definition of knowledge or as part of the definition of truth. I don't think justification is any part of the definition of truth.
But without a mechanism is what I'm concerned about. You're saying this, that there's no mechanism to demonstrate that a sentence or any way to even conceive of a sentence linking to the world except through justification. That's the biggest problem I have with hearing you talk.
There are theories of justification, and I have views on justification, and my own account of knowledge doesn't require justification. I believe it's possible to know things without a justification, but there has to be a causal story, a causal connection between the proposition that I believe and the state of affairs. That the belief has to be the product via a reliable belief-forming mechanism of the state of affairs to which the belief refers. Okay, justification doesn't have to enter into it. As a result, my dog can have knowledge. My dog can know that there's food in its bowl, or know that its dog food dish is empty, or something like that. Even though it can't theorize about it, it doesn't know anything about justification. You could never ask a dog to justify its beliefs. But I think a dog has beliefs, and I think a dog can know things. Okay, it can't know that it knows things, right? But very often we don't know that we know things, right? And I don't think that knowing that you know is a condition on knowing. You need to know that you know in order to know. I can know that this is a cup if my belief arises in the right way. I don't need to know that I know that. I don't have to have a theory of optics and perception and any of the rest of it, and I don't have to know any epistemology to know that this is a mug. I think people, in other words, I think knowledge is a fairly primitive concept, and it's a causal concept. It's not it doesn't require justification. However, intersubjectively, when we are talking, if I say, well, there's a mug here on the table, and you say, oh, really, Ozzy, are you sure? And I go, yeah. Well, and you say, Ozzy, how do you know? How can you be so sure? And I say, well, I can see it. Okay, and then I lift it up and I show it to you so that you too can see it. I've just satisfied a condition of public assertability. Justification, I think, has a pragmatic function for the purposes of persuading other people. It also has a somewhat epistemological role to play in your own cognitive economy when you're trying to scale your confidence up or down. Okay, if you believe something, if you understand the reasons, that is, you understand the causal mechanism by which you arrived at that belief, that is going to bring your confidence up or down accordingly. For instance, if I know that as soon as you find out about motivated reasoning and you understand how it works, one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to think, some of the things that I hold to be true in, say, the political and moral sphere, I'm not quite so convinced anymore, given what I now understand about the kinds of things that Jonathan Haidt talks about in The Righteous Mind and motivated reasoning and how it works. Okay. So justification, I think, serves two functions. One is social. It's everything that you just talked about. It's social and it's indispensable. We can't get by without it. Justification is pragmatic and it is social. There is an internal epistemological role that it can play. It's secondary, though. It's not required for knowledge, but it has to do with how confident we can and should feel about our own beliefs. That is, when you understand, if you can give reasons for why you believe what you believe, then you will feel more confident. I mean, just look at the obverse. What happens when you believe something, someone completely dismantles the reasons you put on offer, and you realize, geez, yeah, those reasons didn't make any sense. You might not want to admit in the moment that, yeah, your confidence is down, but your confidence is already down. And the more you weigh that, the more it will go down. So when you realize that you don't have a justification, or you don't understand the justification, you don't have access to the justification, that does and should drive down your confidence. Okay, but
why? It's true.
It doesn't. Why?
If truth is beyond justification, it's separate from justification. Why should my confidence be lessened or strengthened? Why also would my assertability of a statement rise or fall based on justification if justification has nothing to do with the truth?
It has nothing to do with the truth. It has to do with the intensity of the belief. Remember, belief is an attitude. It's a propositional attitude. You can believe things intensely, or you can have a very guarded belief, a very weak belief, and anything in between, okay? So belief is something that emits of degrees, right? And that's why justification is so relevant to scaling the degree, the intensity of your belief. Truth doesn't admit of degrees, right? So the proposition's true or false.
But knowledge admits of belief, I think you would say, right?
Yes, it does.
Certain kind of belief.
There's a metaphysical truth condition in there, which is why we say that knowledge is categorical.
Sure. So if we're scaling based on justification, what we're scaling is our confidence in the belief that we have, which ultimately could change the belief itself from one end of the spectrum to the other. Then justification still has
change your mind. That's how you change your mind, right?
Right. But what I'm saying is if we leave out the term truth altogether and say that our knowledge is a relationship between justification and belief, then you haven't described correspondence. What you've done is you're inviting pragmatism and deflationary theory at that point.
Yeah, you could, although again, that comes at the cost of sacrificing the intuition that we have about what we mean by truth. We recognize that a belief can be well justified, exquisitely justified, and still be false. That means that the concept of truth cannot be exhausted by the concept of justification. That's why I think we have an independent vocabulary about truth and falsity and correctness and rightness and wrongness and incorrectness and accuracy and inaccuracy that is independent from the concept of warrant and justified and unjustified, and the concepts of credulity and gullibility that those map onto concepts of belief. In other words, we have vocabularies that cluster around truth. We have vocabulary that cluster around justification and cluster around belief. And I don't think any one of those terms is reducible to any of the two others, much less one of them. So I don't think that justification exhausts the concept of truth. The difficulty is this, though. Nobody has a foolproof verification system whereby they can guarantee the veracity of their own beliefs, right? Or the best that you can do is have a well-warranted belief. In fact, I'm sort of on record as saying the concept of knowledge doesn't give you anything over and above the concept, not the concept, but knowing something doesn't give you anything over and above a well-warranted belief, right? If you have a well-warranted belief and you know it, all you've done when you say, I have a well-warranted belief and I know it, is all you're saying is, I have a well-warranted belief that is true. But truth is a metaphysical concept. It's a concept that isn't about us. It's about a relationship between a proposition and a state of affairs. It's an analytical distinction that we make between a justified belief and knowing something. That's why a belief can be justified and false, but knowledge can't be false, right? The reason we have there's a reason why Plato comes up with the JTB account of knowledge, why that's sort of our first approximation, is he points out that it would make no sense to say that you believed something and you thought it was false, right? So belief is a condition on knowledge. It would make no sense to say that you knew something and that whether you believed it to be true or not, or assuming you believe it to be true, if you claim to know something and therefore you claim to believe it and it's false, that wouldn't be knowledge. We recognize that if you did in fact know something, it would have to be true. Otherwise, it's not an object of knowledge, right? Falsehoods aren't objects of knowledge except to know that they are false, right? You can't know something that is false. You can only know something that is true. And
well, there's certainly there's a history of knowing things that have turned out to be bad descriptions, whether or not you want to say they're false, so this goes back to epistemology. How is it that we know something? And the question comes down for me, and I won't waste any more time on it, is that it completely revolves around justification, not correspondence. Of course, we all have sentences, and the ones that seem to describe the state of affairs best is what deserves being called true. But I don't think that's a metaphysical thing. I think it's a way of speaking about sentences. and what we mean by their place in our asserting our task of asserting different things, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. Again, I disagree, though, and let me see. I'll make this the last thing I say on the subject, because you brought up the subject of there have been occasions where we knew things that turned out to be false. Did we, though? Think about when people say, back in the day, people believed that the Earth was flat. Okay, I mean, there was a time in some cultures somewhere where people believed that the Earth was flat. Okay, now they would have said that they knew it. Okay, but we no longer say that they knew it. We say that they merely believed it. They didn't know it. Why? Notice that we don't say they didn't believe it. We don't retract belief. We say, oh no, they believed it all right. But we retract knowledge. Why? Because as soon as you are of the opinion that the metaphysical truth condition, right, the state of affairs didn't match the belief, you say it wouldn't be an object of knowledge, because that is part of the concept of knowledge. In other words, the pattern of attribution and retraction of the words believe and know function completely differently, right? You might, the only time you will say, well, I used to know, like I used to be a theist, for instance, right? And if you'd asked me years ago, you know, Ozzy, is there a God? I would have said, oh yes, there's a God. And then if you'd asked me, Ozzy, further, do you know there's a God? I would have said, oh yes, I know there's a God. Okay, now I would have said that I knew. I no longer say that I knew. Why? Because I think that the metaphysical truth condition isn't satisfied, and it never was satisfied. And so I only thought that I knew. I didn't know that I knew, and I don't know that I knew then. I, in fact, never knew. But notice, I don't say I never believed it. We retain belief when the metaphysics, why? Because beliefs can be false, but knowledge can't be false. And so as soon as we deem that a proposition is false, it doesn't matter with what intensity and degree of conviction the belief was held and how well justified it was, you know, subjectively or objectively. If the metaphysical truth condition, if that state of affairs isn't satisfied, we immediately retract the ascription of knowledge. And so it's that pattern, that difference in how we ascribe and retract belief versus knowledge, which is why we insist that knowledge is tied to truth, right? That pattern's not arbitrary, right? Everyone does it. The only exception is when we sometimes say of people in the past, well, you know, they used to know differently. What we mean is they believed with great conviction back then, right? But we don't think that they actually knew. We're speaking figuratively, right? We're merely pointing to their degree of conviction. We don't think that they knew. We think that they didn't know. We think that they thought they knew. But we don't think that they merely thought they believed. We think, oh no, they believed it. And we still think that they believed it. So anyway, that's...
You and I we're gonna have to Skype sometime. There's just...
Yeah, we have to, yeah. We keep talking about...
Hey, it's not fair, guys. You can't go into a private Skype. We need that right here. I mean...
It's a conversation that could take a while, but there's just so many good things that, oh, I could, oh...
Now,
yeah.
Ozzy, when you talk about the reliability, true belief that you spoke of earlier concerning knowledge, are you suggesting that belief in that sense is not something that has justification to, or are you using justification as in JTB, justified true belief, as meaning something completely different? You know, these are not apples and apples.
Yeah, okay. RTB, reliably produced true belief, and JTB are two different definitions of knowledge.
Right, I get that.
These are not entire theories of knowledge. To have a theory of knowledge, you have to have a definition of knowledge.
Right.
And whatever ingredients you think belong in knowledge, you're going to have definitions of those things. You're going to have a definition for justification, right, and belief and truth and all the rest of it. And then you're going to have a theory about how those all work together. And then certain other things, certain other things having to do with conceptions of the normativity of rationality and stuff like that. So a theory of knowledge and epistemology is more than just a definition of truth. But the definition a definition of knowledge. The definition of knowledge that I work with, that I think again, best describes what we're talking about when we say that someone knows something or doesn't know something, and when we retract an description of knowledge. The definition that best tracks that, that best characterizes that, is reliably produced true belief. So, on my view, justification is important, but it's not a necessary condition for knowledge. You don't need to have a theory, or you don't have to be able to state the reasons, okay? If there is a causal pathway, if I hold up this mug, for instance, consider a perceptual belief, the belief that there's a mug in front of me. I'm holding a mug in my hand in front of me, okay? If my belief that there's a mug in my hand in front of me, here and now, notice it's it's a perceptual belief, so it's indexical. It's about the here and the now, okay? If right now there is, in fact, a mug in my hand, and that mug is causing me to have the perceptual belief that there is a mug right here in my hand, if that causal story is true, then I know what I think I know. Okay, that's the definition. Okay. Now notice I don't have to have a theory of optics. I don't have to know anything about how the visual system works. I don't have to know how the play of light works, and nothing about neurophysiology or anything like that. Right? It's just a causal account of knowledge. It's a causal story. As long as the belief is the product, the causal output of the state of affairs, and there's a reliable belief-forming process like visual perception or memory or hearing or deduction or induction. If there's some reliable belief-forming process that explains, that accounts for how the belief arises, such that the belief arises causally as a result of the state of affairs about which the belief refers, then you're in a condition of knowledge. You don't have to be able to offer a subjective justification. You don't have to know about the workings behind the scenes. It's all working, it's all going on in the plumbing anyway, well below the level of consciousness, right? Now, some of our beliefs are not perceptual, right? My opinion, for instance, that a certain person is trustworthy and reliable or something like that is not a simple perceptual belief, right? It involves judgment, it involves recollection, it involves some perceptual beliefs like having witnessed certain things and heard certain things and trusting certain things. There's going to be a whole justification that I can give.
Right.
Okay?
No.
So there will be occasions where the reliable processes, okay, when I spell them out, serve as the justification. But it's true even in the case of the cup, okay? So if I look at the cup, and if I were able to tell you how light bounces off of the cup, and that that there are reflective surfaces here on the cup, and the light bounces off of it, enters my retina, stimulates the cones and rods in my eye, up my optic nerve into my visual cortex and all that. If I knew that whole story, okay, I could give you the justification for how I know that this is a mug. All I can say, though, is I see the damn thing. It's all I can say. The only approximation that I can give you is, well, I see it. Okay, that's the summation of it, right? And so if you ask me to justify it, that's what I'll tell you. But wait a minute, what if I'm hallucinating? Well, if I was hallucinating, the belief wouldn't be caused by the cup. It would be caused by something else in my brain. It wouldn't be caused by the cup. So it wouldn't be a case of knowing, all right? So in other words, the reliably produced true belief account satisfies the counterfactual conditionals for things like if you were dreaming, if you were mad, if you were in a drug-induced state, and such and such. But most of the time, if you think about what you're doing when you give a justification, what are you doing other than trying to give a causal story of how the belief arose in you? How a belief, whether it's a political opinion, whether it's an assessment of a person's character, whether it's an assessment of whether there's a mug in front of you, in virtually every case, what you're trying to do at best when you give a justification is reconstruct the causal pathway between the state of affairs and the belief that refers to that state of affairs, okay? That's what you're trying to do when you give a justification. Much of the time we can't do it, which is why many of our beliefs, for instance, are non-inferential. This is not like when I say I see the cup, I don't infer that I see a cup from a visual experience I have. I just have a visual experience of the cup. Boom, it's immediate, okay? And there's a causal story to be told, but I don't know what it is. You need to talk to, someone who knows more about, brain chemistry and so forth, and neurology than I'll ever understand. So that's what justification is. When you give justification, invariably what you're doing is trying to reconstruct the causal pathway that is the reliable production of a true belief. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get another person to say, believe me, there's a causal pathway between the state of affairs and the state of affairs that I'm telling you about. Okay? That state of affairs out there caused me to believe in the state of affairs that I'm telling you about, and here's the causal pathway. That's what we're doing when we're giving a justification. But the giving of a justification isn't part of the causal pathway. It's just my reconstruction of it that I tell you to persuade you that I'm not just talking out my backside, right? I'm trying to get you to take seriously that my belief was caused, was occasioned, arose, is the output or product of a reliable process that was initiated by an actual state of affairs that the belief refers to. That's what I'm trying to do when I give a justification. I'm just recapitulating. I'm trying to reconstruct and recapitulate the causal pathway. And you can do it for the cup, and you can do it for, why you think Trump is a good or bad president, and why Hillary would have been a better or worse president, and all the rest of it, right? Things get more and more tenuous the further you get away from strict physical causal pathways where judgment gets involved and stuff like that. But nevertheless, you are always just trying to give the reasons, and by reasons I mean the causes, for why you believe what you believe. That's what justification, I think, consists of. And we do it largely for social reasons, and also for getting your beliefs to scale, your confidence to scale.
Hey, Ozzy, making reference back to your map analogy, which I've also used myself, is we've been implying, like with regard to the perceptual beliefs, the map isn't fully under our control. Doxastic involuntarism. The map changes itself in a way.
Right.
Or it is changed outside of our control.
Yeah, well, I'm a doxastic involuntarist. That is, I don't believe that I decide my beliefs. They get decided for me. I believe what I do quite helplessly. That doesn't mean that there isn't motivated reasoning and stuff like that. That does, in fact, go on. That's one of the mechanisms which can lead you helplessly to believe something. And so you want to get good at identifying motivated reasoning when it's happening in you, so that you are not believing, for bad reasons. So in the case of correspondence and this, you are at the mercy of your brain, right? Your brain is the thing that's making the map for you. Okay. You don't get to stand outside your brain, look at the map, and look at the world to see if the map is right. Okay? There's just your brain making the map on the fly, making revisions and corrections. And the process of correcting that map, it's either informed by critical thinking and an understanding of psychological capacities and limitations and liabilities, or it's not. And if it's not, you're going to have an inaccurate map. And the more you know about epistemology and critical thinking and fallacy theory and the limitations of our psychology and the biases and heuristics and algorithms that are running in our brain, the more you understand that, the easier it is going to be to revise your map in a way that is error aversive, that allows you to avoid errors instead of rushing headlong into them. But we are not in control of our beliefs. I think we believe things rather helplessly. One of the things you want to do is train your mind to be able to generate. I mean, imagine if you had two. It's like this, okay? It's training your mind to have ever more reliable belief-forming practices, okay? We can distinguish between reliable belief-forming processes and reliable belief-forming practices. A reliable belief-forming process would be something like memory. I didn't learn to use my memory. I just use my memory. I just remember things. I don't learn to use my eyes. I just see things, okay? There's some learning that can go on in there. You can study art, you can study visual perception, you can learn to see things a little differently, you can train your memory, you can improve your memory, okay? But there are these processes, think of like hardware processes, and then there are practices, things like the use of, the correct use of deduction, the correct use of induction, for instance, okay? Or abduction, okay? Those are practices, okay? Those are things that we do as opposed to things that just basically hit us rather passively. Okay, you want to make your belief forming, just as you want your belief forming processes like vision and hearing and memory to be as accurate as possible, as truth conducive as possible, you want your belief forming practices to be as reliable as you can make them. And that's part of what epistemology and critical thinking and training yourself to be a better reasoner is all about. It's tuning up that instrument as much as possible. It's just, imagine if you had two eyes. You have one eye that is, kind of blurry and one that sees very, very acutely. Well, you maybe want to put a patch over one eye or something like that and not rely on the eye that's not so good and rely just on the good eye wherever possible, unless there are occasions where the blurry eye serves you better, right? And then you have to sort of learn to discriminate when it makes sense to use one or the other. So, critical thinking and teaching yourself critical thinking is a way of conditioning your brain to make a more accurate map than it otherwise might. Does that answer your question? Does that address it? Maybe not.
I think it did. One of the things that I wanted to point out, if I can, is that when it comes to doxastic involuntarism, and I hold that position as well, I don't think that those who think that we are making choices to believe X, Y, or Z, I don't think they have really looked at the data. But when it comes to belief versus acceptance, there's a big difference between the two. Or do you think so? And do you think that belief is, let's say, a brain state?
I suspect belief is a brain state. And usually when I say accept in an epistemological sense, all I mean is take to be true. If I say, well, I accept this, what I'm saying is I accept something to be the case.
But you believe that that's voluntary. It's much different than belief, because some people have argued that acceptance is the same thing as belief.
I don't decide to accept things as true, right? I can decide to accept your hand in friendship if you extend your hand, but when that's not that's not acceptance in its epistemological mode,
right?
But when I say, well, I accept that as true, I can be speaking in one of two ways. I can be speaking hypothetically, right, or like metaphorically. I say, well, I'll take it. I accept that in the sense of arguendo. For the sake of argument, I'll accept that, right? But normally, when I say I accept that as true, what I mean is I take it to be true, right? I think it's true, right? So I sometimes hear atheists say things like, I don't believe evolution. I accept the fact of evolution. Well, those are the same thing. There's no difference. But all it means to believe that evolution is true is to accept what you take to be a fact, namely that evolution happens, right? There's no difference there, right? Now, sometimes you can use the word accept as a kind of qualifier. You say, well, I'll accept that, meaning I'll go with that for the sake of argument, right? But normally when you say I accept something, you're merely stating that you regard something as true, and you're phrasing it as if you have accepted it. All I mean is this is entered into my head, and I take it to be true, right? It's sort of using an active verb to describe something that happens without your will.
So are you suggesting that acceptance is involuntary as well?
When it's used in that sense, yes.
Okay.
Normally, when we accept things, if I accept a phone call, for instance, that is a decision, right? I don't helplessly find myself answering the phone. I accept the call. I hit accept call, and I take the call, right? But when I accept something into my belief set, that's just a figurative way of saying I have come to believe it.
Yeah, I get that. I get that. Hey, I've enjoyed the show. We've gone a long time, yet not really a long time. I enjoy listening to you and Stephen. I enjoy having you on, just talking with you one-on-one. I would love to have you on the show, just one-on-one, you and me, talking about some things that really concern me about theism, atheism, and agnosticism, especially when it comes to the question, because I really have a problem with how the question has been approached. And I'm one who keeps nuancing. We need methodology. We need so many things that we don't have currently. And I would like to have you on talking about that. Would you be interested, Ozzy?
Yeah, sure I would. I don't know when we could do it. And
Hey,
I sort of feel like
we
I
can
owe
talk about that on a private
now.
message or something like that. Yeah, we can set something up. But
Yeah,
I would like
sure.
to have you on, and let's just go at it one-on-one, because when I had and this is the thing that I don't like, when I had Saitin Bruggencate and Eric Hoven in the studio, I was talking with Eric Hoven. Even before that, I was talking with Saitin Bruggencate, and so many times I was interrupted. And sometimes when you are in the studio with an individual and someone interrupts you, they stop a moment. And I remember the moment that Eric Hoven, he didn't know what to say to me, because he could tell that I was a compassionist. He didn't know how to explain my love for people outside of Jesus Christ. And I was trying to get him to understand there's more to it than just the narrative that he was spinning. But it was Greg Bray who interrupted and just said, hey, I want you to be on my show and blah, blah, blah. And it really poo-pooed the whole thing. I mean, it gave him an out. He didn't have to respond. But I think that if we can have conversations without so many interruptions, sometimes that pause gives people room to think. It does something for us. In other words, sometimes when you say things, I don't want to give you an immediate answer or response. Sometimes I want to think about it, because I think too many times we're just waiting to respond rather than listening, if that makes sense. And I would rather listen to what you're saying and try to not use my mental lexicon and build arguments and take the stuff that I think that I know, if you will, against what you're saying or for what you're saying. I would rather rethink it in real time, but I find that most of us are not doing much in real time in conversations, and perhaps you agree with me.
Well, as someone who is well known for being long-winded, I certainly hate being interrupted, because it takes me forever to get to a point. I often find I have to build a big, long ramp to finally get to the point, to my jumping off site, and that's not a shortcoming on anybody's part, and I certainly understand when people interrupt me before I sort of get up to full speed. That's just, I lack the gift of concision. So yeah, I certainly appreciate that, what you're saying there. And let me thank everybody who's been listening and who's in the Hangout now for their forbearance, letting me prattle on this way, especially Stephen, because when Stephen and I talk about these subjects, I can see he's going to blow a head gasket listening to me go on and on. And when he was talking, and I don't think he probably didn't talk for more than 3 or 4 minutes, and I had to bite my tongue over and over again, and so I don't know how he does it. So thank you, Stephen, for putting up with me. Really appreciate it.
Well, I give you a lot more reason to bite your tongue than you do for me. So I'm very criticizable. I don't criticize much.
Well, I've had a lot of fun. I was going to ask for final comments, but wow, I don't want to get into more questions. But I will say this: this has been good. I do want Diana to jump in, and Carrie. They've said nothing. just say something about the show, and then we're going to end this thing.
Well, I love discussions like these. I am learning. I'm trying to work everything I hear into what I know or what I think I know and revise from there. So this is very, very productive to me, and I am very, very thankful for the opportunity to sit here and listen. And thank you, Ozzy, for being on. I mean, you are always a good voice of reason here. So I guess that's it from me.
By the way, Carrie, you did a great job pre-show stuff. I mean, that was good. What say you?
Well, Kerry had to drop out a little while ago.
Okay, I didn't
He
know
had
that.
something else to do.
I'm in the dark when it comes to this. Okay, I need a screen up here that has everyone on there. Jordan, just say something positive here.
Well, I do appreciate the use of analogies. I think, especially the more sensory they tend to be, the more concrete we can make it, the easier it is to communicate it. And I've been saying this ever since I heard it. Is analogy is the core of cognition, I think. So, just how true that is still blowing my mind. But in regards to the discussion we've been having, I've been curious, looking for an opportunity to talk with Stephen about the metaphysical God that he mentioned once before. I don't know if he's gone into detail about that before, but I would be curious to know what that is, and just to know what his perspective is. Of course, he doesn't have to persuade me of it or anything, but that's something I'm curious about myself. The metaphysical conversation.
Sounds good. Stephen, what are your thoughts? I mean, wow. This has been, in my opinion, a very good show.
Well, I love listening to Ozzy expound on the greater mysteries of life, and for the most part, he's right. We always have good conversations because on this one topic we don't generally agree, which makes it so fun because we're both really well. Hopefully, I'm giving him some reason to be pressed into the dark recesses of the inability for correspondence to work. And same thing with me, the worthlessness of just saying, well, we're just asserting things and, it has a utility to it, but what it has to do with reality, well, other than usefulness, because we really do want to get at the truth. Anyway, so I love having those kinds of discussions, and I hope we're communicating our differences in a way that other people can appreciate and evaluate on their own. But enjoyed being a part of the show. And Jordan, just 2 seconds. The philosopher's God is my idea of God. It'd be closest resembling to Brahman, a principle, something that doesn't exist, but has like energy, has some linkage to the world. But that's a long story with a short beginning there. Anyway, but enjoy the show. I appreciate it. What's that?
Sometime you'll be able to communicate it through analogy or two, right?
Yeah, I've got you on Messenger, so I'll shoot you a brief something maybe tomorrow.
Okay.
Sounds good. Before you joined Ozzy, I stated that back in, I think it was 79 or 80, I was ministering at a particular church, and I made this comment, and I went back and found it. I said, God is no more than the abstraction of the idea by which people have oriented themselves to produce a functional society. I don't know what your thoughts would be on that as to how you would label a person if a person believed in what I just said. And number two, do you think that human beings are built to be initially neutral about the world that we find ourselves in? Those are questions that I would like to hear answers to, and I'm not expecting you to answer any of that tonight, but I've really enjoyed much of your rhetoric tonight. I mean, it's been very, very good, and you and Stephen going back and forth. I think this is what we need. It's pleasant, very informative. It gives us something to think about from different vantage points, and so thank you for being here. And so I'm going to give you the final thoughts, and please close the show in however way that you want to. And after that, Jack is going to play our outro.
Well, I have too many thoughts on what you what you just said, you heretic, you, about your anecdote. Maybe we could talk about those sometimes. I have a number of thoughts on those, both those subjects actually. But well, let me just say I've enjoyed the conversation. It's especially gratifying to talk to Stephen about these things and argue. I find myself when talking with Stephen going all over the place more than I usually do, because I can hear objections bubbling up in his head as I'm saying, and I sometimes veer away from what I was going to say to go into a kind of objection blocking mode, which is not the best form of exposition. It's a little too self-serving, anyway. But it's challenging, and I really enjoy it.
It's good that you actually recognize that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It must have happened 5 times where I was like, "What the hell was I saying?" I just veered off into trying to forestall an objection that I know Stephen is waiting to say. So that's really a little bit selfish on my part. So thank you all for listening and putting up with that. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.